Honourable members, the Deputy Speaker.
Are there any constituency statements by honourable members? And I call the member for Kennedy.
Madam Speaker, Huon's population, when I was elected to Parliament, was 4,000 people, 3.5 million sheep. Across the map of Queensland, it said the best natural grasslands in Australia. Huon today has a population of 1,000, dwindling and vanishing. It has nearly a quarter of the area covered by prickly acacia tree, rapid invasion and destruction of our natural soils and our grasslands and our flora and fauna, where we had the railways earning 200,000 a year, some of them, the drivers, the shearers earning 200,000 a year. Now there's no railways, no shearers. The town is 1,000 people, and population-wise, dying. What we are going to do is we're going to put a dam there and take a measly, tiny, weeny little 1/6, 1/10, 1/16 of the waters of the mighty Flinders River, a little tiny bit of it, and we're going to turn that town into 15,000 to 20,000 people, prosperous, rich, with 150 farmers owning their own irrigation farms, drought gone forever, and a place where you can earn, those farmers will earn $500,000 each a year. They will be contractors in the town earning $500,000 a year, and they will have freedom and space. This will be a land of prosperity, freedom and space. This will be where every Australian wants to live, instead of the destruction which has been wrought by successive ALP and Liberal governments that deregulated the wool industry and completely destroyed it. 3.5 million sheep went down to about 100,000 sheep, and they destroyed the railways completely. There's no railways now at all, except a railway line carrying minerals, and very few minerals at that. Completely destroyed, again, in this case, by the Labor Party and the Liberal Party. That is what has happened in Huon, and we're telling you what is going to happen in Huon, and we hope that Anthony Albanese, who has visited Huon twice, it will also be the home of the biggest wind farm in Australia. Very famous McClymont family are up there building these windmills. The very famous Keir family from Townsville Construction will be building the windmills, and Twiggy Forrest will be building the biggest wind farm in the Southern Hemisphere at Huon as well. And we thank Anthony Albanese for putting the money in to make it on the crossroads, north-south, east-west. And his contribution really was the touchstone to get that highway built, which cuts 2,000 kilometres off the road from Cairns to Melbourne.
Your time has expired, and I call the member for Boothby.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Digital access is so important to our lives. While I and many in this place grew up in the pre-computer age, nowadays, without access to the internet, those with poor access to the internet are significantly disadvantaged. And I can't imagine having to write a university assignment without the internet these days. Fast broadband is important for students, whether they're learning online, trying to research online, submitting assignments online. But fast broadband is also important to businesses, retail needing to access the bank for financial transactions and perhaps expand their markets online. Service-based businesses operating online to gain and provide services nationally and internationally, or simply the activities of running a business, submitting their BAS statements. Or for recreation, whether it's researching your family tree, streaming television shows, participating in online interest groups, or for those who are part of the 67% of Australians who play online games. And of course, so much of our daily lives interacting with government and other services now occurs online, whether it's dealing with MyGov, MyAgeCare, NDIS or telehealth. Those households and businesses stranded on the old copper network are significantly disadvantaged. And I'm sure, Deputy Speaker, at some stage you've been in a situation where your internet has cut out at just the wrong time. 5 minutes away from finishing the last episode of your TV show or movie, 2 minutes away from submitting that crucial assignment, 1 click away from sending an email to your boss, or trying to access government services like MyGov, My Aged Care, NDIS, telehealth, and then the internet help fails. You frantically click at the button, reload the page, restart your device, but there's nothing you can do about it. You have to start again. And so I'm thrilled with the announcement to upgrade the NBN fibre to premises in the Boothby suburbs of Blackwood, Belair and Bellevue Heights. They join Hawthorn, Marion, Morfettville, Pasadena, Plympton Park, South Plympton and St Mary's, which have all recently been upgraded. In total, 4,336 more properties in Blackwood, Belair and Bellevue Heights and neighbouring parts of Mayo will be upgraded to fibre to the premises and will no doubt make a significant benefit to their ability to access the internet for work, study, recreation and their everyday lives. In our modern age, fast, reliable broadband is vital for households and businesses. The Albanese Labor government is delivering. Thank you.
Call the member for more.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With the federal budget due within 3 months, my focus is on lobbying the government to secure more federal funding for the Moore electorate amid difficult economic conditions. I've worked closely with the cities of Joondalup and Stirling to lobby for an increase in federal financial assistance grants to our local government authorities. As a result of strong advocacy efforts, I'm pleased to inform the House that the annual grant delivered to the City of Joondalup in the current 2022-23 financial year will amount to $6.43 million, representing an increase in funding of 33% from the $4.84 million received the previous year. Similarly, federal funding to the City of Stirling also increases by 35% to $7.94 million. In addition, the cities of Joondalup and Stirling have been successful in securing $2.9 million in funding under the latest round of the Local Roads and Community Infrastructure Program. This Commonwealth funding represents a significant subsidy for ratepayers, enabling our local councils to deliver the priority local road and community infrastructure projects listed in the Forward Capital Works budget. The City of Joondalup has been allocated $1,439,855, whilst the City of Stirling will receive $1,431,569 under Phase 4 of the program. Both councils will be able to access their funding allocations from July 2023, with projects to be delivered by June 2025. I've also been busy campaigning for an additional $120 million in federal funding for major road projects, namely the connection of Whitfords Avenue to a realigned Mangara Road and the grade separation of the Reed Highway at the extremely busy Erindale Road intersection with a traffic bridge. During the election campaign, I secured a federal funding commitment of $20 million for this project, which will make the daily commute for 8,000 more residents safer and more direct. I now call upon the Albanese government to match this funding. Similarly, the Reed Highway flyover will connect residents in the coastal suburbs of Moore to the economic activity hubs of Balcatta, Malaga and beyond via the Tonkin Highway and Northlink. For the thousands of FIFO workers in Moore commuting to Perth Airport regularly, this will be a huge advantage. The previous budget delivered $2.5 million towards the design of the project, and the Albanese government now needs to take the next step to announce a funding commitment in the order of $100 million to deliver.
I call the Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise today to speak about a tragic accident that took place recently in my electorate of Hotham, but also about the incredible display of strength and leadership and courage in my community that's shone through in the aftermath. The Bright Moon Buddhist Temple in Springvale spectacularly lit into flames about 9 days ago. 150 firefighters were called to the scene and it took about 2.5 hours to bring the flames under control. Deputy Speaker, the heartbreak that this has caused in my community, it is really hard to put into words. This temple has been under construction for 25 years, and to see it be burned down in 2.5 hours, the local community is just simply and completely devastated by this. For all of you who have got places of worship in your electorate, you would know that these temples are not just religious centres. This was a community hub where thousands of my constituents would gather together to share spirituality. It was an unusual temple, Deputy Speaker, in the sense that lots of different communities worshipped there. I've got lots of Chinese constituents, Cambodian, Vietnamese ethnicity constituents who worshipped there. Even some of my Indian Australian constituents would use this temple as a gathering place. It was the heart of the Buddhist community in my electorate. Now, the local community has suffered an intense personal loss from the fact that this important piece of our local area has suffered so much damage. But something else I know has been very, very distressing for people is that somewhere between 5 and 10% of the 600 urns containing ashes were destroyed in the fire. Enormously important spiritually to the people of my community, Deputy Speaker. I did want to share with the chamber just briefly that I visited this community on Sunday to stand with them and talk to them about how I wanted to help their rebuild efforts. And they told me that the firefighters had arrived and they explained the importance of the urns, and the firefighters were able to salvage almost 90% of those urns. And it just really made my heart sing to think that the community came together, understanding the importance of the urns to that community, and were in the end able to save most of them. So I want to acknowledge the emergency service workers who slaved so hard to try to minimise the damage of the fire. I value you intensely, and your hard work does not go unnoticed by our community. It's going to be a really long road to rebuild, but I can say that if there is a community out there that can do this, it is my community in Hotham. And it was a privilege to stand with Mr Vin Lee, who is the president of the community there, on the weekend and discuss how we can try to work together to do this. It's moments like this where everyone in my community is hurting together, but also building with optimism together, and it makes me very proud to represent this amazing part of South East Melbourne. Thanks, Speaker.
I call the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. We are all part of the story. Regardless of how you chose to mark Australia Day, it's a wonderful phrase which captures our nation's spirit. We are all part of the story. With those words, I wish to briefly tell the story of some of those in my electorate who were recognised a few weeks ago. People like Stuart and Annette Baker from Albury, among 9 new OAMs in Farrer, who have fought tirelessly since the death of their daughter in 2001 to help reduce stigma surrounding mental health. Another champion for mental health awareness and reform, Loreen Liebenberg, Edward Rivers Citizen of the Year, is a passionate advocate for her Deniliquin community. With much of Farrer suffering from flooding late last year, Nick Smith from Rankin Springs dropped everything to help locals escape overflows from the Lachlan River. Nick is Citizen of the Year in Carrathal Shire. Leanne Dalitz, Oakland's go-to person for help, has provided 30 years of service to schools, sporting clubs and community groups, and was presented with Federation Council's top gong. To Leaders of Tomorrow, young Daniel Hawkins from Curlwa is Wentworth's Young Citizen. During a year as primary school prefect, he managed to pack in local football, cricket and rowing, as well as the Scouts volunteering at the annual Swimming Carnival, Wentworth Show, Gymkhana and Pooncary's Desert Dash. Speaking of events, I was delighted to see the Euston Salami Festival celebrated with an award. If you want a marker of modern Australia's melting pot of personalities, customs and flavours, I suggest you book early for the next festival in November. Another event celebrated, and one I was honoured to attend last year, was the opening of the Berrigan Memorial Wall. Helped with some federal funding, the local RSL and community has built a magnificent and considered tribute to those who've served in this nation's conflicts and peacekeeping operations. I want to make a special mention of Paul Mayton, a mayor and former councillor for over 30 years with the Shire of Leeton. Paul was made a member of the Order of Australia after countless hours spent on various community groups and charities as a volunteer. He, like so many local Australia Day honours recipients, noted he never sought such recognition, but it's kind of nice when it comes along. It was the same for Albury's Volunteer of the Year, Chris Thomas, the driving force behind local cancer support group Brave Hearts on the Murray. Time prevents me mentioning every one of the honours bestowed to so many worthy recipients, but you are all part of the story. So too the 100 or so new citizens of Farrer who chose to become part of our proud, ancient, multicultural nation. And however you marked January 26, this is very much worth remembering. Thank you.
I call the Assistant Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Labor is red, the Liberals are blue. On this Valentine's Day, I have a poem for you. In just 12 months, so much is new. Let's have a look at what we've all been through. Back then, our ex-PM did not hold a hose, said 'twas not a race. Did he lie? Macron knows. We went to an election and the choice was easy. Australia did choose Prime Minister Albanese. His plan for a better future was what the country had needed, a positive vision for Australia as PM Morrison receded. Onto these benches we moved, and that's when it all came out, all the secrets they'd been hiding, all the mistruths they had spout. Weeks before the poll, in a cunning secretive plot, the member for Hume gave non-disclosure a shot. No, it wasn't doctored travel receipts. No, it was much worse. It was Minister Taylor's secret hit to the purse. A 20% jump in the price of our power, kept hidden during the campaign, released in the final hour.
This is a clear breach of the standing orders, casting inferences against another member, and you shouldn't be doing it.
Member can, the Assistant Minister may continue.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. But that wasn't all, and the truth did flow because there was much, much more Australia did not know. Prime Minister Morrison was not busy enough, so he started coveting his colleagues' stuff. With Josh as his treasurer and Greg Hunt in health, our ex-PM decided to do those jobs in stealth. Without telling the public, he played his constitutional tricks, deciding he was so good at his job he would take on another 6. Despite this betrayal, this detailed hidden proof, his colleagues could not criticise, despite the harsh truth. In contrast, our new PM has led from the front, tackling challenges head-on and not being such a stick in the mud. Already we've enacted a wave of reform, an anti-corruption commission and public service to transform. There's fee-free TAFE places, new spots at Uni 2, we're fixing aged care and the NDIS for you. We're helping to relieve costs with cheaper childcare, there's discounted medicines and a budget to repair. And this year we embark on a constitutional choice on whether we should have an Indigenous voice. The reasons are clear: to give our First Nations a say, and to those who have supported it, I say happy Valentine's Day.
I call the Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Today I rise to address the ongoing conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and I call on the Australian Government to clearly state a position on this matter on behalf of Australia and the Australian people. This conflict, which tragically reignited in September 2020, has resulted in the loss of life, the displacement of innocent people and the destruction of infrastructure. As members of the international community, we all share a responsibility to speak up, to clearly call for an end to the violence and to call for the protection of citizens. I want to acknowledge the work of the Armenian National Committee of Australia, who have been consistent advocates for peace in Artsakh and for consistently highlighting the need for the safety of the Armenian people. The recent upsurge in violence has resulted in the displacement of thousands of people and has had a devastating impact on civilians in the region. If I can quote the words of the Armenian National Committee, quotes, "On 12 December 2022, Azerbaijan launched a new wave of aggression, cutting off the only land link between Artsakh and Armenia in an attempt to subjugate the civilian population to a new form of psychological terror. This conflict is causing enormous pain to the people of Armenia, but also great pain to the many Australians of Armenian background. Many Australians of Armenian background live in the northern suburbs of Sydney, including in my electorate of Bradfield and in the neighbouring electorates of Bennelong and North Sydney. Many members of this community have raised their concerns with me, and I am pleased to have the chance to speak up on their behalf in our national parliament to highlight the grave concerns they have and that I very much share. I want to specifically express my concern about reported human rights abuses occurring as part of this conflict, including credible allegations of the targeting of civilians and credible allegations of the use of illegal weapons. These actions are wholly unacceptable, they are inconsistent with international law, and they must be condemned in the strongest possible terms. I call on Azerbaijan to cease hostilities and to engage in negotiations to find a lasting and peaceful solution. And I call on the Australian government to speak up clearly in expressing the principle of the sovereignty of borders and raising our clear concerns as a nation about the conflict in Artsakh and the aggression demonstrated by the nation of Azerbaijan.
Call the Minister.
Thank you. And in my electorate of Eden Monaro, the community of Queanbeyan found themselves grappling with a homelessness and housing affordability issue. And did they sit back and do nothing? Absolutely not. This community took the bull by the horns and they enacted the Queanbeyan Housing Action Collective, a voluntary collective consisting of the St Benedict Community Centre, Molonglo Support Services, Carabai Housing Cooperative and the Terry Campese Foundation. And they realised the need for urgent action. They identified a project, Sleep Bus, the brainchild of Simon Rowe. Sleep Bus has the simple aim of providing a safe, temporary, overnight accommodation for our community's most vulnerable. And a big shout out to Kelly Rickson, a superstar who steps up every week in all different roles to ensure that Sleep Bus is open for vulnerable people in our community. I was so incredibly proud that she was recognised on Australia Day as Queanbeyan Citizen of the Year. Since Sleep Bus Queanbeyan began its services in March 2021, it's been able to provide over 1,000 safe sleeps. That's a huge achievement for a volunteer-led organisation in our community. Carabai Housing currently provides 21 affordable homes to our local community. They manage another 6 and they have plans to build more. They believe having a place to call home has an enormously positive impact on an individual's quality of life and well-being. Their mission is to provide quality, affordable housing for people on low to moderate incomes in the Queanbeyan region. Carabai Housing has established a fundraising committee and they are working towards a fundraising launch date of 22 July 2023 in Queanbeyan. And I urge people to get on board and support the work of this vital organisation in our community. Because we are doing our bit here. The Albanese Labor government is now taking action against homelessness through the National Housing and Homelessness Plan, which is the single biggest investment in social and affordable housing from a federal government in over a decade. We will deliver 30,000 social and affordable homes in its first 5 years. Legislation that makes a real difference to thousands of people's lives. And I really encourage those opposite to support the 10-year strategy that will address the mess that we've inherited from the previous government. The Albanese government making a real difference in regional communities.
And I call the member for Flinders.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This Valentine's Day, I want to talk about one of my true loves, my mate Chris and his colleagues at the beautiful Sages Cottage in Baxter. Sages Cottage Farm in my electorate of Flinders is a brilliant, innovative and unquestionably hard-working property that is owned and managed by Wallara, a leading disability support provider and a social change agency. Since 2016, Wallara has provided life-changing pathways to employment for people with a disability in the heritage-listed Sages Cottage Farm and Cafe. The farm caters for varied needs and provides a safe space for the development of skills that sit outside conventional employment pathways, including horticulture and hospitality. The cottage has been seeking state and federal government funding for their proposed Inclusive Jobs Hub. However, this proposal and Wallara's multifaceted services continue to fall outside of a particular portfolio, resulting in repeated unsuccessful funding requests. I was proud to have committed $750,000 in the lead-up to the last election, but with the change of government, this commitment was unable to be followed through. The Inclusive Jobs Hub will double the training capacity of Sages Cottage Farm, which will also provide meeting rooms, activity rooms and administrative space that will allow staff to vacate the heritage-listed cottage itself. The cottage will then be used to house a gift shop, staffed by clients with disabilities, which will diversify the skills that can be taught at the farm. The upgrade will double the farm's training capacity from 50 clients to 100 clients. It will also create a highly flexible space for our partner organisations, which in turn would create more engagement between those organisations, the Mornington Peninsula community and Wallara itself. Wallara has already invested or committed $2 million of their own modest reserves to purchase the farm outright and to upgrade the facilities to their present state. They've done a torrent of work recently to raise funds from friends, family and philanthropists. They have taken in-house their food and beverage offering at their beautiful cafe so that the proceeds go to benefiting their future plans. But they need our help. I have sought the assistance of the Albanese government, asking the member for Maribyrnong, the Minister for the NDIS, to come and visit the beautiful Sages Cottage with me and see the magic that is happening there. I do hope that at some point in the future he will accept my invitation. Equally, I encourage the new state member for Hastings to use his seat at the table in Spring Street to support Sages Cottage. There are few organisations as worthy as this one. I shout out my thanks to the great Phil Hayes-Brown, CEO, for his endless and inspiring advocacy for Wallara and Sages Cottage. Funding from state and federal governments will allow this magical place to grow and provide invaluable resources for disability employment on the Mornington Peninsula and Greater Melbourne more broadly.
I call the member for McEwen.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Last Friday, we were lucky enough to have the wonderful Minister for Early Childhood Education and the Minister for Youth, the Honourable Anne Ali, come to visit our electorate of McEwen. We visited the Mernda Early Learning Centre, where we toured the facilities that had both long day care and 3- and 4-year-old kindergarten programs. We met with Centre Director Bianca Alsade, and I've got a chat with the staff and about the need for childcare educators to be respected and valued. We were happy to tell them about the support Labor is giving fee-free TAFE, which will help attract more people and ensure educated professionals come into the profession. We also talked to the real impact cheaper childcare will have on all their families and the conversations they've had on how Labor's policy will provide some of the much-needed cost of living relief for so many families at the centre. Of course, we had a bit of fun, rolled up our sleeves and had a good play with the kids before packing up and heading across to Woodend to visit Youth Live for Life. Youth Live for Life is a program that focuses on youth mental health and suicide prevention. It is a very sad fact that the already alarming teen suicide figures increase for youth in regional and rural areas, which is why programs for Youth Live for Life are so important for an electorate like ours in McEwen and my neighbouring electorates such as Bendigo. We met with CEO Bernard Galbally and the youth crew, who were happy to sit round the table with the Minister and I and discuss the biggest issues that the teens who access the program are facing now. We chatted with Jasper Selby, Alana Sanders, Sasha Anderson, Laura Crozier and James Selby, who are only some of the great crew at Youth Live for Life. And we both came away determined to do the right thing by these strong and wonderful people. The Minister assured them that the Prime Minister is a champion for the youth and values their input into the insight into the development of policy. Tongue-tied there. Which is why we are investing millions into mental health and wellbeing in schools to support children who have struggled following COVID. Now, quite often, sadly, we hear the opposition misrepresenting the recent positive changes free mental health, when in fact it was the government is just following through on the commitment they put through on their policy. We followed through with this because the added visits led to strain on our mental health system, with more people who were in crisis missing out, especially in regional and rural kids where resourcing is already an issue. We will do more than slapping a band-aid on this issue when the problem is systematic. And I was incredibly lucky to have the Minister out to our beautiful electorate of McEwen and show her the amazing work done for our young children and teens. We know that this work is delivering positive results, and it's an absolute asset, and I would encourage all members to look at the Youth Live for Life program and see how these young champions can come into your area and help build stronger mental health capabilities.
I call the member for Groom.
Speaker, my hometown of Toowoomba is grieving the death of Mr Robert Brown at the age of 75 yesterday. Mr Brown died of injuries sustained in an attack that took place in broad daylight outside the Grand Central Shopping Centre, his young attacker, with great cowardice, violently shoving him from behind before stealing his backpack and running off, stealing a car and racing through our community. We've heard this story all too often in Toowoomba. But the death of Mr Brown has stirred something in us. He was a gentleman who faced something of a hard life, dealing with his impairments with a smile on his face and something akin to grace in his dealing with others. The Toowoomba Chronicle has given voice to our anger, starting its Enough is Enough campaign.
In accordance with Standing Orders 93, time for members' constituency statements has concluded. Apologies, Member for Broome. And I call the clerk.
Government business, order of the day, Treasury Laws Amendment, Consumer Data Right Bill 2022, resumption of debate on the second reading.
And I call the member for... Apologies. The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Warringah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak about putting data ownership where it belongs, with consumers. It's tempting to sit in this House and pass legislation based on the written word. Customer data rights remind us that what we are really here to do is benefit our communities and help all Australians get a better deal. The Treasury Laws Amendment, Consumer Data Rights Bill 2022 follows in the footsteps of the Treasury Laws Amendment, Consumer Data Right Act 2019, which inserted a new Part 4D into the Competition and Consumer Act 2010 and allows consumers to share their data with trusted parties. Now, we've had a lot of scandals and headlines of the last few months around that retention of data by certain companies and how secure that has been. So it's quite at odds to know that whilst companies are holding it, consumers themselves do not have that right to their consumer data. So at its core, the intention of the CDR initiative is to hand back to consumers ownership of their own data. It is a truly transformational initiative. So far, it's been rolled out in banking, and energy was initiated at the end of last year. Telecommunications is currently being considered. So the bill being considered by the Parliament now takes it to the next logical step. It enables consumers to use their data to take actions which are designed to, amongst other things, get them a better deal. To achieve this, the Minister must declare, by legislative instrument, the types of actions that can be initiated under the CDR. Certain parties must also be assessed and accredited. Importantly, consultation with Treasury, the ACCC and the Information Commissioner is mandatory. In the current and evolving environment, the CDR initiative is becoming increasingly important. Many consumers are already under stress, and this will only increase. CDR can help consumers to alleviate that stress. CDR creates an opportunity not just for individual consumers, but also for small businesses. Small businesses can either use CDR to get better deals or be participants in the provision of CDR services. So small business has an added layer of complexity, and this needs to be incorporated in implementation. To make this real for consumers, we need to focus on what's important to them. Consumers want to get a better deal, so they need to understand how they go about it. The implementation of this bill will be critical. Consumers must have knowledge of how it operates, must have trust in the participants, processes and outcomes, and must have the confidence to use it. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's critical at this stage of the development of CDR that the consumers be involved in how it's going to be rolled out. To maximise the benefits, this will require a more flexible, collaborative and innovative process that may otherwise be the case. Consumers and what is most important to them must be an integral part of the rollout. What we do in this next stage will dictate the success or otherwise of CDR as an initiative. We need to put consumers squarely at the centre of the outcomes of this bill, and I urge the government to really put that at the forefront of their mind. We do this actively by engaging and educating them now. So I welcome the measures proposed in this bill, as would all consumers, because it gives control back to consumers and enables them to reap the benefits of their own data. I encourage the government and the minister to adopt innovative approaches to expeditiously designate the types of actions that can be initiated under the CDR, and such approaches must not compromise consumer protection, the rigorous data management and risk minimisation for all participants. Last year we saw what could happen and we must avoid any repeats. I implore the Minister to exhaustively address the need for extensive engagement and education so consumers can take advantage of this excellent initiative. And I urge the government to do a review, nevertheless, of a number of legislative instruments to ensure that we are up to date with data with data protection, because we have seen just the high level, the cost and the damage and impact when there are insufficient protections in place. I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Casey.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And through each and every transaction that all Australians make, whether it be online shopping, scanning rewards cards, or liking posts on social media, we produce data for companies. And whether we realise it or not, these companies are collecting data on our behaviours and spending habits in order to monetise that data. And the reality is, our data has become a product that can be packed up and sold to those looking to target us and make a profit. Now, data is used to target ads towards individuals with certain interests or a certain demographic. It's used by retailers to target their regular shoppers and by banks to manage risk. Now, data collection is the reason that we all get emails about our favourite snacks that are on sale at Woolworths or Coles, and why the banks call us about their latest products. And while there are some benefits to this, there's clearly some risks as well. And I've spent, prior to my time in Parliament, 15 years in business and worked in small business, had the opportunity to work at Mars Australia, a large multinational, and we used a lot of data, and in many ways it was a great asset to us. It allowed us to make sure that we could target the products that consumers were looking for and ultimately make it easier for consumers to find what they were looking for. I also spent time at a tech company called Ritual, and at that business we had access to a significant amount of people's data, both their personal data but also their spending habits, even their movements through their iPhone. So it is, there are significant benefits to us as consumers and as to society by being able to maximise that data, but it does bring risks, and there is no doubt that businesses profit from that. So it's only fair that if we're going to allow businesses to use that data for their own means, that consumers have the right to protect and own their data. And that's why there is so much power in the data. But until the consumer data right was introduced, the power sat primarily and solely with corporations. And consumers themselves had no power or opportunity to access that data. And the consumer data right was a significant economic and consumer-centric reform. It was the previous coalition government that spearheaded the rollout of the consumer data right. We did this to protect consumers, reduce red tape, improve cyber resilience and support digital innovation in the delivery of core business functions. Now, it was first launched in the banking sector in 2020 to give consumers and small businesses more power over their own data to compare and switch banking products. And I would note at this time that the lead minister for introducing the consumer data right was the then Minister for the Digital Economy, Senator the Honourable Jane Hume. And I've called before in this House and will continue to call in this House for the government to appoint a Minister for the Digital Economy to oversee and implement a national digital strategy. The former coalition government had the Australian Digital Strategy for 2030, which set the foundation and frameworks for how we, as lawmakers, could make sure that society benefited and the economy benefited from data, but that also their rights were protected. And it's something you need an overall minister because it impacts so many different portfolios. So I'll continue to urge the Albanese government to give the digital economy the respect it deserves, the leadership that it needs, and appoint a minister for the digital economy. Now, this bill would further expand the rights of consumers to access their data, and it is a bill the Coalition are supporting. The bill will introduce action initiation reforms, which will enable consumers to direct accredited persons to take actions on their behalf using the Consumer Data Right Framework. Consumers may direct an accredited person to make a payment, open an account, switch their provider, or update their personal details across a range of providers. And at its core, this bill is all about improving consumer outcomes while driving digital innovation and productivity across our economy. Now, the Productivity Commission says that digitisation is a doorway to greater economic growth and to boost our productivity. And we all know, with the significant economic challenges we face at the moment and high inflation, productivity is a key driver to bringing prices down and continuing our economic success. And reforms like this are necessary because of the impact red tape is having on the economy and on consumer outcomes. Now, independent research has estimated that the annual cost of red tape to our economy is $175 billion each year. In the financial sector alone, there are 140 prudential standards and practice guides covering the 5 APRA-regulated industries. Now, the Australian Law Reform Commission's legislative framework for the financial services sector sits at over 43,300 pages. The burden of compliance is significant, particularly for small businesses in my community who do not have the luxury of in-house legal teams or the ability to appoint administrators to cover paperwork. And that's why it's so important that we get this reform right. It's got to make life easier, not harder, for consumers and for small business owners. And this bill will allow consumers to go to one of their service providers and say, please update my address on all my accounts. No longer will we have to let every service provider know, or get those ones that are missing and suddenly the details of the bill never comes through. So it's going to improve the lives of many Australians. Do it once, transform it all the way through. Such an important initiative. And by expanding the consumer data right to include action initiations, consumers will be empowered to authorise and manage their data securely in the digital economy. It will further allow them to share the data that Australian businesses hold about them, but importantly, for their own benefit. And as I've spoken about previously in this place, about the importance of the digital economy, and it has the potential to contribute $315 billion to our economy. But one of the greatest setbacks to growing our digital economy is consumer reluctance. Consumers often misunderstand how their data is harvested and used. And we do know there are significant concerns that consumers rightly have in the current environment about whether their data is safe and secure. And we must always make sure that we are setting frameworks that ensure cybersecurity and consumer data protection is at the front of everything we do. So through giving consumers expanded control over their data being shared, we're in turn increasing their faith and confidence in the future of our digital economy. The consumer data right was always designed to grow over time. And while in government, the Coalition pursued expansion into the banking sector through open banking. We also pursued expansion into open finance, the energy sector and telecommunications. Not only is the consumer data right enabling consumers to benefit from their data, it is spurring the creation of new tech companies and encouraging more innovative products and services. The consumer data right is underpinned by stringent privacy and security protections, so important, as I mentioned. It prioritises consent, meaning consumers can choose whether to use the data right, and providers must receive explicit and informed consent to use their data. And it gives consumers, really importantly, full visibility over who their data is being shared with. Now, this bill expands the consumer data right from a data sharing scheme to a scheme that allows consumers to act on the information that they receive. For example, this could allow consumers to change energy providers following receipt of information about other providers offering lower prices or more suitable circumstances. And in this current environment, the ability to switch easily and take advantage of low prices is so important. It's all about making it easier for consumers to compare products and services and access better value for money. It's something that's so important with the energy crisis that we have, the cost of living crisis that we have. We all know many Australians are doing it tough, and anything we can do in this House and in this place to make their lives easier is such important legislation. It's one of the many reasons that I'm supporting this legislation. However, this legislation on its own will not be enough, and we need to acknowledge that. And the government must do more to support business and our economy, because Australian businesses and families are struggling, and they need a government that listens to them, not one that tells them that the government is the centre of the economy. Business in Casey and across the nation, I've spoken to many of them, have identified the issues and offered the solutions to Australia's economic challenges, but they feel that they are not being listened to. And the challenges they face are significant, not just on the expenses side, but talking to a small business just last night, and their revenue has dropped over 30% since Christmas as consumers are starting to pull back. So small business has significant challenges, whether it's increasing costs or lower revenue. We need to make sure we're doing everything we can to support them. Now, legislation that the government plans to pass in the next year calls for a huge $45 billion in extra borrowing for extra spending, and this spending is off-budget spending that's not going to be shown in the budget. But the IMF have already warned about how this will drive inflation and make the cost of living worse for Australians. And these are things that we have to avoid. So while we are supportive of this bill for its benefits to consumers, the digital economy and productivity, Labor must start listening to businesses and addressing the issues that we are facing today. With this government's priorities, Australians will always pay more under Labor, and it's essential the government brings small business and consumers with them on this reform. The consumer data right has been carefully designed from the beginning to ensure strong privacy and security mechanisms are built into the design. The government must get this right to maintain the integrity of the scheme and strengthen our consumer faith in our digital economy. And I will finish by again urging the Albanese government to appoint a minister for the digital economy, because if we do not have one person overseeing our strategy, we miss significant growth opportunities, but we also leave Australians exposed to some of the cybersecurity risks that we saw last year. If we don't have a plan, how can we implement it to make sure that we are maximising the opportunities available to the Australian people when they need help so often? Thank you.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The Coalition understands that our digital economy matters. It is crucial to our success as a nation that our businesses are innovating and adopting digital technology. Not only does digital adoption enable entirely new businesses and sectors to grow and flourish, creating jobs and prosperity, it also delivers efficiency gains for businesses in sectors like mining and retail, because it creates efficiencies, lifts productivity, generates more profits and raises incomes for workers. In government, we developed a digital economy strategy with a view to driving the digital advancement of small businesses, of our workforce, of startups and of infrastructure. Under the current government, there is no such focus. There is no Minister for Digital Economy. There should be. There is no clear digital economy goal committed to by the Australian government. There should be. The Digital Transformation Agency has been relegated to the bowels of the Finance Department. The Albanese government should be making our digital economy a national priority. There needs to be a serious drive towards digitisation in sectors where such take-up is falling behind. The government should be getting on with the work the Coalition started on a digital identity scheme. Australians should have access to better and more efficient government services, meaning more of how we interact with government should be digital. And in the increasingly challenging security environment in which we live, cybersecurity should be prioritised, incentivising, for example, businesses to take practical steps to reduce their risk of hacking. I've spoken of the Coalition's digital economy strategy, and the consumer data right was a key part of that. Established through legislation introduced in 2019, the consumer data right represented a bold step in increasing the level of digitisation in Australia's economy. A consumer data right gives Australians the ability to have their data shared with businesses when they want that to happen, such as, for example, when comparing and switching providers for an energy plan or a bank loan. This is particularly relevant in 2023, as the Albanese Labor government presides over a worsening cost of living crisis, having wholly failed to implement their promises of cheaper mortgages and a promised $275 cut to household and business power bills. In July 2020, the consumer data right became active for financial products and services, referred to as open banking, with the Big Four banks able to meet customer requests for banks to share their data for home loans, investment loans, personal loans and joint accounts. In the 2021 budget, the Coalition invested $111.3 million to speed the rollout of the consumer data right in banking, energy and telecommunications. The Coalition's detailed work to bring the energy sector within the net of the consumer data right meant that this was able to occur in November last year. Following advice from government agencies and following thorough consultation with the sector and with experts, strong privacy and information security provisions were built into the legislation. The privacy protections under the regime have been developed on the advice of the Australian Information Commissioner, and the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner will have the job of enforcement. The reality is, Deputy Speaker, that Australia faces an environment in which our national productivity growth, according to the Productivity Commission, is at its lowest rate in 60 years. This is where digitisation holds great promise as a doorway to greater economic growth and efficiency. In the case of the consumer data right, the capacity for a consumer to have his or her data shared or passed from one competitor in a sector to another means that those businesses competing in those sectors will have to work harder to keep existing customers or to acquire new ones. They will have to evolve to become more productive. In 2021, the Treasury undertook a strategic assessment into the economy-wide rollout of the consumer data right. The then Coalition Government's response to that report summarised key factors to support future prioritisation and sequencing of the expansion of the consumer data right. These included the benefit for consumers. Inclusion of datasets should enable improved decisions to be made by or for consumers which are beneficial to them. Secondly, the value for data recipients. Inclusion of data sets should create value through enabling innovation by data recipients, which improves productivity. Thirdly, the transformation of sectors. Inclusion of data sets should align with the need for the sector to be digitally active. A fourth consideration was the cost for data holders. Inclusion of data sets should not cause an unjustifiable net cost to data holders. And a fifth policy driver is inclusion. The data sets should align with or support the achievement of other policy goals. Now, the bill before the House today, the Treasury Laws Amendment Consumer Data Right Bill 2022, amends the Competition and Consumer Act to enable consumers to, quote, authorise, manage and facilitate actions securely in a digital environment, close quotes, under the data rights framework. The Coalition supports this bill, and as we have made clear, we will seek to refer it to the Senate Economics Legislation Committee to report back by the end of the financial year. The bill further implements the rollout of the consumer data right by introducing a new channel within the legislation, enabling consumers to instruct a business to initiate actions such as making a payment, opening and closing an account, switching providers and updating personal details across providers on a consumer's behalf with the consent of that consumer. It therefore provides consumers with the ability to initiate actions under the data right rather than simply having their data shared. As an example, under this legislation, the consumer could instruct a single service provider to update his or her personal details. There are clear benefits in terms of a stronger set of cyber security arrangements from making this possible, as well as the more obvious benefit of giving consumers access to a simplified, streamlined and less onerous process. This particular measure implements a recommendation from the report of the 2020 inquiry into the future directions for the consumer data right. And that recommendation was that the consumer data rights functionality should be strengthened and deepened. That recommendation was accepted by the previous coalition government. That being said, the opposition notes that there is some concern that we have detected in consultations about the capacity and ability of businesses to implement these reforms effectively and in compliance with the rules. Small business operators and businesses that primarily service small businesses that rely on high levels of data have concerns about their obligations under the Consumer Data Right and their ability to implement reforms on the timelines proposed by the government. Data sets that fall within the net of the Consumer Data Right can be large and complex. It is therefore critical that these Consumer Data Right reforms are implemented properly and tested, so consumers can have confidence that their data is safe and so that public faith in the scheme more broadly is preserved. This is a key reason why, as I've already indicated, the opposition is seeking to have this bill referred to a committee in the Senate so that that committee can more closely examine the way that businesses are envisaged by Treasury to implement these reforms in line with the timeline that's been laid out. Deputy Speaker, the Consumer Data Right has the potential to deliver significant benefit in our economy in driving both better consumer outcomes and in driving innovation by companies, by businesses, as they compete to provide the best products and services for their customers and as they compete to win customers. We do know, regrettably, Deputy Speaker, however, that when it comes to the task of implementation of policy, Labor governments often go woefully, disastrously, spectacularly wrong. And there is a litany of public policy disasters that Labor governments have presided over the past 20 years, and if we were to go back earlier than that, we'd find an even longer litany. We therefore, in opposition, take very seriously our role in scrutinising the work of the government, composed as it largely is of a ramshackle collection of former union secretaries. We do think it's appropriate to bring to bear some expertise in implementation, which I'm pleased to say those of us on this side of the chamber, many of us who have significant private sector backgrounds, are able to deliver. We don't deny that the skills that, for example, the minister who's presently in the chamber learnt by standing in front of demonstrations with a megaphone yelling out, "What do we want? X. When do we want it now?" I could acknowledge the Deputy Speaker's own expertise in that critical function as well. And all of these are important. They're important skills. They're important skills, Deputy Speaker, I don't doubt that. But the question that I simply ask is to what extent do they equip those people who are presently ministers in this government with the capacity to actually implement complex reforms? And if we look at the record that the minister presently in the chamber has racked up in about 8 months, that's a very obvious question. So we're here to help. I'm pleased to tell the chamber we're here to help. We're here to offer the benefit of our extensive private sector expertise, and we'll be doing that conscientiously when it comes to the Consumer Data Right Bill.
Right, okay. Who am I calling? The Minister.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. It's always a pleasure to follow the member for Bradfield. I want to pick up for a point he made where he observed that at the closure of 9 years of the Morrison, Turnbull and Abbott government, they left Australia with the lowest productivity growth in 60 years. And as Professor Paul Krugman famous US economist, said, at the end of the day, productivity isn't everything, but it almost is, and nothing sums up the legacy that the coalition government have left the country than the worst productivity growth in 60 years. I do agree with him that the consumer data right has the capacity to provide productivity enhancements, particularly in the delivery of services. But I've got to say, it takes a lot of gall from the member for Bradfield, who as minister was responsible for flogging off a $3 million block of land for nearly $30 million. I mean, with somebody like that in charge of money, you'd be very, very worried indeed. These were the mob, and the idea that they're lecturing us on a digital strategy and the infrastructure necessary for a modern economy is the stuff befitting of comedy. The man who was single-handedly responsible for campaigning against the establishment and the building of an NBN when they were last in opposition promised us that we were going to have an NBN that was going to be faster, cheaper and quicker, delivered an NBN which was slower, more expensive, not just by a little bit, but cost us twice as much as it otherwise would have cost us. It has taken much longer to complete. The modern business registry, a critical piece of IT infrastructure, they promised was going to be delivered for somewhere in the vicinity of $460 million. We now know that that project will cost somewhere in the vicinity of $1.5 billion. So their track record on delivering IT projects is woeful. The digital IT project has been handed under the previous government from minister to minister to minister, and each and every one of them has failed to deliver on the promise. They talk about cyber security and scams. Scams costing Australians $2 billion a year on their watch, no strategy to deal with it. And they advise us that they are going to refer this bill and indeed the future of the project to a Senate committee so it can be scrutinised. Can I just say we welcome that? We welcome that. I think that'd be good. And as they're scrutinising the project that they are sending to the Senate committee to investigate, they might ask some questions about the funding that was allocated under the previous government for this project, which we are told by them was critical to the productivity driving future of our economy. Because if it was so important, why did they cease funding for it in June this year? A project that we've just heard from the member for Bradfield was central to their economic reform. They left unfunded. So I think we can take with a pinch of salt the claims that have been made by the member for Bradfield. There are some things we do agree on though, and that is that the consumer data right has the capacity to significantly enhance productivity, particularly in the services sector. And once this bill is passed into law, it sets the basis for expanding to combine the power of data sharing with the ability for consumers to safely and securely instruct third parties to initiate actions on their behalf. In future, this could include things such as opening and closing accounts, making payments and applying for services. The reform will give individuals and businesses more control over their data, empower them to make informed choices, as well as many other things. This will reduce the time pressures, cost and complexity experienced by individuals and small businesses when carrying out everyday tasks. These changes to the CDR are underpinned by strong privacy and information security provisions that are at the core of the CDR, and security and other checks outside the CDR will continue to apply. It's an important expansion, empowering consumers to authorise, manage and securely make informed choices in a digital economy. I thank members for their contribution to the debate and commend the bill to the House.
I thank the Minister. I'll now put the question. All those in favour say aye. Against? Okay, we'll declare that carried.
Second reading, a bill for an act to amend the Competition and Consumer Act 2010 and for related purposes.
If no member wishes to consider the bill in detail, I will put the report question immediately. The question is that this bill be reported to the House without amendment. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. And I call the clerk.
Government business, order of the day number 1, securing Australia's sovereignty. Resumption of debate.
The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Spence.
Thank you, Acting Deputy Speaker.
Do you normally have that effect on people?
I would like to rise and take note of the statement made to the House by the Deputy Prime Minister in his capacity as the Minister for Defence on the 9th of February 2023. The ministerial statement provided the House with an appraisal of Australia's sovereign capabilities, speaking broadly to security challenges within a local and global geopolitical landscape which we reside and participate in. However, this ministerial statement was holistic in the sense it spoke to the maintenance of Australia's sovereignty in the face of our strategic partnerships, as well as the challenges that we face in the present and in the years ahead. We were presented with blueprints for how Australia can coexist in a complex, challenging, strategic environment and prosper. Prosper by utilising our talents, our natural advantages and our ability to innovate, and punching well above our weight as a nation. Acting Deputy Speaker, the ministerial statement touched on a few core themes worth mentioning here. The first being the current set of strategic circumstances that Australia finds itself in, the state of play in a geopolitical sense. Next, it began to describe Australia's position in the world and particularly our role within the Indo-Pacific region. It also further outlined a set of broad principles that Australia ascribes to when it operates alongside strategic partners and allies, namely how Australia ensures that it acts in a manner consistent with its interests and at its behest alone. The ministerial statement devotes a large section to outline the importance of Australia's strategic relationship with the United States of America, describing the United States as our most vital security partner. The benefits of joint facilities and partnerships with the United States and the terms in which our strategic allies, namely the United States, operates on our soil. Lastly, the Minister's statement speaks to the future of this strategic partnership, the AUKUS partnership. One, a security partnership forged between Australia, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America. Acting Deputy Speaker, Australia is fundamentally a lucky country. Its relative political stability, coupled with strong established alliances and partnerships in the regions surrounding our lands and beyond. Australia is, after all, a country girt by sea. A natural advantage in many ways this may be, but on the other hand it can be isolating to an extent. There are many out there, sadly, that view this isolation as something that we should actively seek out. As one of the founding member states of the United Nations, this is a very unfortunate attitude for some out there to possess. Since the end of the Second World War, we have been at the forefront of ensuring that diplomacy should be tried before violent alternatives are sought. The ministerial statement itself contends that we live in an age of strategic circumstances that are the most complex and challenging since the end of the Second World War as well. It is why we need to seek out friends, strategic allies, where we can join them to further our goals and extend offerings of friendship where relationships are at best mixed. It would be wrong to see the blue ocean abroad and label the map "Here be dragons," for we know Australia's involvement in our region is a positive one, both in the sense of our soft diplomacy, fostering and encouraging shared values and ideals with our neighbours and unlocking new and exciting avenues for trade. Acting Deputy Speaker, it would appear that I have spoken on an issue without speaking about my electorate of Spence, a state of events that I simply can't endure any longer. Because, as a proud local member, I feel obliged, duty-bound in fact, to highlight some of the numerous ways that Australia's strategic needs have been enhanced and fulfilled within my electorate of Spence. As many would know, my electorate includes RAAF Base Edinburgh, along with the Edinburgh Defence Precinct, which was built around the base and contains a number of organisations, both government and civilian, with a large focus on defence manufacturing and technology. And speaking of manufacturing, the heart of the northern suburbs of Adelaide was first established to operate as a satellite town around our manufacturing industry. I, like many of my constituents, lament the death of General Motors Holden a few years back. The death of car manufacturing was felt not just in the loss of jobs, but in the loss of our soul in the north. It's why I'm especially proud, long before the ministerial statement was delivered last week, to take every opportunity I can get to come into this place to speak about defence industry and associated advanced manufacturing capabilities that exist within Spence. Many of the big players in defence industry circles operate within Spence, primes such as Lockheed Martin Australia, Saab Australia, Raytheon, General Dynamics and Northrop Grumman. I am sure many within the membership of the Edinburgh Industry Alliance, had they been listening to the minister's statement, would be heartened that there is a coherent strategy in place to utilise hubs such as the Edinburgh Defence Precinct. Within the precinct operates a renowned innovator full of engineers hard at work, innovating the next big technological advances that will give Australia a leading edge. As it so often is, defence research has been the catalyst for technological advances in the civilian sector. Many of those advances have been born out of the minds that work at the Defence Science Technology Group, or DSTG, the architects behind the invention of the black box flight recorder. There are always big things happening at RAAF Base Edinburgh. One of the hubs that helped to ensure being girt by sea remains an advantage. The base is home to the P-8A Poseidon that can perform maritime surveillance operations, and its SIGINT capabilities within the base are second to none. I'm proud that Australia can hold our own in that respect, but it's always a little better when it's happening in your very own backyard. My electorate of Spence is also home to a number of agricultural ventures and secondary food industries such as Safcol Cannery, who, at extensive scale, contribute to safeguarding Australia's food security for tomorrow whilst feeding Australians today. We can all do our part within our patch of this great country, but it gives me comfort to know that my electorate of Spence is well poised to strengthen our sovereign capabilities and make a positive contribution to our national security. And Acting Deputy Speaker, the ministerial statement made by the Deputy Prime Minister may not have received widespread coverage on every evening news channel, but you can guarantee that many an embassy or High Commission down the road would have been tuning in. This statement sets a tone for many countries that interact with Australia, whether it be a strategic relationship, one involving trade, or whether your nation is seeking Australian support, financial or in kind, to fund a number of development goals. You will know in broad terms where you stand and how the government look to interact with you under different sets of circumstances. It represents a modicum of consistency amongst an ever-changing world and geopolitical landscape. I am content in knowing that the nation-states are going to have similar realisations to the Australian public, that being the realisation that the adults are in charge of the Australian government, and it is ready to adapt to changing headwinds and grow our country in its international standing, but also its economic output in the process. It is true to say that these times may have challenges associated with them, but they can still be exciting ones, where our country grows to meet those challenges and ends up better off as a result of doing so. As a nation, we can have a booming defence industry, yet lead the region with our diplomats. There is no opportunity cost. It just takes the right kind of leadership to foster. Leadership that I am confident we have at the helm. And I thank the House.
I thank the member. And the question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Riverina.
Here is their spirit in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. They are words spoken in 1948 by Charles Bean, and they appear at the temporary entrance to the Australian War Memorial. They evoke great patriotism, great nationalism. They are in the right place because as everybody who walks through that national monument, that Australian treasure, they walk past those words, hopefully they read those words, and they might just take it in and reflect on it after their visit is over. Because indeed, in that war memorial, that proud national monument, there are the names on the rolls of honour of 103,000 men and women who sacrificed their lives in the service of our country, in wars past and deployments present. And this is a motion about Australia's sovereignty. And I'll reflect on two former Labor Prime Ministers. Billy Hughes, World War I, who fought the good fight, and certainly when the Treaty of Versailles was being drawn up, he wanted to make sure that the blood of Australians was not forgotten. The blood that was shed, Gallipoli, Western Front, Africa and other front lines, was very much respected by those putting the treaty together. And John Curtin, and we all know the furious communications that occurred between London and Canberra when the 14th Prime Minister of this country said that he was bringing our troops home. Our troops were needed here. Not a lot of people realise that there were more bombs dropped on Australia's northwest and north in World War II than were dropped on Pearl Harbor. And we were under threat, we were under attack. And Mr Curtin, and I know that Gundagai in my electorate was the scene of a famous wartime cabinet meeting between Mr Curtin and his colleagues, and they made the right decisions at the right time. And we need our governments to do just that, to put our country, our people first, because as the Shadow Defence Minister said in his contribution, at the very outset, let me begin by saying that the opposition shares the Minister's view that our sovereignty, our territory, our values and our way of life are a sacred duty of the Australian Government and indeed of this Parliament. On this question, the Coalition are of one mind and spirit with the Government, for if we cannot secure and defend ourselves, we have failed at the most basic duty entrusted to us by the Australian people. He's right. The Deputy Prime Minister, when he spoke about those very traits, was correct too. And we need to, in as bipartisan manner as we can, absolutely defend that sacred duty. Now, I'm proud to be the federal member for Riverina, which takes in Wagga Wagga, which is the only inland regional centre of its size with all three arms of the defence. And we've just had a changing of the guard as such at the Kapuka Army Base, where Colonel Tim Stone has taken over as the Commandant there. He has the huge responsibility of leading the recruit training at that base. And every recruit does their basic training at that base just west of Wagga Wagga, southwest of Wagga Wagga. And we're very proud to be a military city. If you spend any given time in the Royal Australian Air Force, you may very well end up at Royal Australian Air Force Base Wagga Wagga at Forest Hill. Very important logistics base, very important training camp. And combined with that camp is a Navy base. Now, we're a long way from the nearest drop of seawater, but we have a Navy base at Wagga Wagga and they do a lot of important strategic work. And I know when they have their special occasions in Wagga Wagga's Victory Memorial Gardens, There are many young naval people in uniform, personnel, and what is remarkable is their youth. But they are so proud to turn up and to represent that proud form of service in our tri-service city. Now, this is important, this motion, what is before the House, because we need to have a commitment to national security, and it doesn't matter who is in government, it doesn't matter what side of politics, we can't drop the ball when it comes to national security. And I have to say, we never have as a coalition. We've always put our national security first. I know the commitment that we made when we returned to government in 2013, I have to say, to readjust some of the thinking and some of the spending that had lapsed. It was important that we do so at that time. It was the former coalition government that increased investment in defence to more than 2% and invested more than $270 billion into capability to 2030. And I'm very pleased to say that as a former Assistant Minister for Defence and a former Veterans Affairs Minister, that considerable spending, almost $1 billion, is going into upgrading the infrastructure at both RAF Wagga and the Kapooka base, both of which I mentioned earlier, the importance that they play in our national security. And that is going to replace, in RAF's case, some of the very ageing 1950s and 60s infrastructure, which was badly in need of replacement. And at Kapooka, it's going to take them to the next level. They do a lot of adventure wing training, obstacle course. They put those young recruits, men and women, through their paces, and they turn out the best, the bravest, the boldest, and that's what we need wearing our khaki. And it stretches back to Gallipoli, even before that, that level of commitment by Australian soldiers, and indeed Kapooka has been there since the Second World War. RAF Wagga, well, they've had a commitment there on the old Allenville property since the late 1930s, and Navy has been in Wagga Wagga since 1993. The coalition, as I say, made sure that our investment was what it needed to be. And I must say that our investment was highest when the now opposition leader was Minister for Defence. And so he has a commitment. He has a track record for making sure that we've got the right money in the right places. And I heard the member for Herbert, himself a former infantryman, talking in the matter of public importance debate today about making sure that our soldiers have the right kit, and that's so important. I know the member for Bendigo is proud of the fact that her hometown produces the Bushmaster, and indeed, as a coalition government, I'm glad that Labor has backed it up since coming into government, our commitment to Ukraine, of those vital personnel carriers to do what they can to repel the illegal invasion by Russia. We've got a lot of pressure on Australia and on the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere across the globe at the moment. There is a lot of pressure being brought to bear on those who want to preserve democracy and those who believe in freedom and peace. And Australia has always been there, whether it was Afghanistan, previous commitments to that, or whether it's in the current deployments that peacekeeping and otherwise that we need to make sure that we are a part of, that make sure we're on the right side, that we are always there. And I commend our ADF, I commend those people who run the Australian Defence Force for doing just that. And it's a big ask of those who serve in this place, because we are the ones who commit Australian soldiers and other defence personnel into battle. We do that, and it's a heavy burden to bear. I never thought it would be until I was part of that, part of those motions and debates that went before the House of Representatives, when, of course, we were talking about Afghanistan and other conflicts that we've fought in the recent past. The coalition will always be there. Sovereignty is so important. The level of trust on Labor at the moment is very high because they are the ones in government now, but they certainly have bipartisan support when it comes to national security.
I thank the member. The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And just before I begin, I want to agree with the member for Riverina. Defence, Australia's sovereignty is a bipartisan issue because defence, national security, Australian sovereignty affects everyone. It affects everyone in this room. It affects my community in Robertson on the New South Wales Central Coast, people in the member for Reed's electorate, in the member for Riverina. It affects all Australians, and it's so important that we have a bipartisan approach to our national security and to Australia's sovereignty because it affects us all. And with that, I would say that the Albanese Labor government is committed to the safety and security of our people in every electorate, in every corner of the country, rural, remote, metropolitan, regional, coastal and inland. Everyone, we realise that this is of paramount importance. And as was said by the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Defence recently when this statement was brought before Parliament, the risk of conflict is now less remote than it was in the past, and that we now live in a less safe and we now live in a less stable world. And this highlights to me, highlights to every member of this parliament, highlights to our community the importance of international diplomacy and the fact that we need to work collaboratively with those within our region, particularly with those throughout the Indo-Pacific. Because our interests are not only onshore, our interests are not only within Australia, but across the entire Indo-Pacific region, across our neighbours. And peace and security throughout our region is what we must absolutely strive for, and what we must continue to champion. Every person in this place, we must continue to champion that for Australia's sovereignty's sake. And as was also noted by the Deputy Prime Minister, we have benefited from our trade from China, and we absolutely value a productive, mutually beneficial relationship with China, and we seek as a government to stabilise this. And furthermore, Australia and the government must continue to work collaboratively, and we must continue to work constructively with countries throughout our region to continue to reduce tensions, but also to maintain peace, to maintain security, which has led to ongoing and years of economic prosperity right throughout the region. Our international partnerships and relationships are vital in advancing our interests and allows us to navigate the complex strategic environment that is our region and that is our world. We must ensure that the norms, we must ensure the principles and the rules throughout the Indo-Pacific are reinforced by our partnerships with nations throughout our region. And moreover, it is important that with these partnerships we champion a free, we champion an open and a prosperous Indo-Pacific. And that is done by pooling resources. It is done by combining our strengths. And in doing this, we can deter conflict. We can have a free and we can have an open region. And we can have peace. We are continuing to strengthen our cooperation and partnerships with our neighbours throughout the region. I'm talking the likes of Japan, South Korea, Singapore, India, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea and Indonesia. A nation I've spoken about in the chamber before, teman-teman di utara, our friends to the north, a nation who we will continue to strengthen our relationship with now and into the future. Our continued commitment to invest in groups and bodies that champion peace and that champion prosperity throughout our region is paramount, such as ASEAN and the Quad, crucial to stability, crucial to security and, importantly, economic development in the Indo-Pacific and the broader region. To give some further examples that was discussed by the Deputy Prime Minister in Parliament earlier this week, for over 30 years, the nation of Singapore in Southeast Asia, our Singaporean friends have trained in Australia to our mutual benefit, to the mutual benefit for Australian sovereignty. From major exercises in the Shoalwater Bay area, helicopter training and pilot training at RAF Base Pearce. Australia's been proud to support Singapore in building its capabilities, and this cooperation continues to our shared security and, furthermore, to ensuring a secure Australian sovereignty. Singapore training in Australia has brought significant advantages, particularly for sovereignty, including investment in our ADF facilities and economic benefits to Australian business. And they helped us in our time of need. It's definitely helped us in our time of need. The Singaporean Armed Services made a significant contribution to our local communities here in Australia during the Black Summer bushfires in 2020 and the floods in 2022. And what I'll reiterate is that we are no longer blessed, as the Deputy Prime Minister said, we're no longer blessed with that benign strategic environment. The world is a less safer place than it was years ago, and that's why we need to work collaboratively with our partners through the region, in particular, I should stress, Indonesia, our friends to the north, and make sure that we champion those ideals that I've mentioned to make sure that we have peace. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I thank the member. The question is that the document be noted, and I called the member for Sturt.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and indeed I take the opportunity to talk about defence sovereign capability at every opportunity in this place, particularly as a proud member from the City of Adelaide, and of course it won't surprise members that I'd like to focus my remarks on naval capability and where we've been, where we are and where we are going to from a sovereign capability point of view, because of course it's vital for any nation to have sovereign capability to produce the major assets, the major capabilities that underpin our national security capacity. And not surprisingly, that wasn't always the case in Australia's history. In the early days of the Royal Australian Navy, of course, the United Kingdom was the provider of most of our major capital ships and our technical capability and capacity. And of course, the Oberon-class submarines that preceded the current Collins-class submarine were a British vessel, but it has been the case that over the last few decades we have dramatically developed our own capability in naval shipbuilding in Australia, and this is vitally important for our future. The Collins-class submarines, indeed, were conceived and built in Adelaide, and that was really the milestone decision of the federal government, the Hawke government, I give them credit for that, of course, to develop a naval shipbuilding capability centred on Adelaide. And the future for that couldn't be brighter going forward. But the Collins class, of which we sell six Collins-class boats, as they inform me submarines are called, not vessels or ships, boats. The six Collins boats were all built, of course, in Adelaide and continue to be maintained in Adelaide. And the full cycle docking that occurs there is effectively a complete rebuild of the submarine. They take the boat out of the water, crack into the pressure hull, which is a very significant thing to do, and when the full cycle dock happens every 10 years on each of those six, that is a major ongoing piece of engineering capability that we have in South Australia, and frankly it is as significant, some say even more significant, than the original construction of the submarines themselves, such as the significance of full cycle docking, which happens a couple of times in the lifetime of those submarines. And the Collins, the previous government made the important commitment that this government are sticking with, to my understanding, that the life of type extension to the Collins, which we need, in order for the Collins to still be the capable boats that the submarines that the Navy need, whilst we transition to nuclear propulsion, is also happening in South Australia. And I was very engaged in the campaign to make sure the awareness was there within the decision-making structures of Navy, Defence and the then government, that the commitment to keep that in South Australia was maintained, and indeed that commitment was made at the same time as the announcement of AUKUS. The air warfare destroyers, all three, also built in Adelaide. And so from a surface vessel point of view, we're also very proud in South Australia of the capability that we have for surface vessel construction. And that was underscored by the decision in 2015 that the 9 future frigates would be built in South Australia in Adelaide. And that was a very welcome decision, a very significant decision to replace the Anzac-class frigates. So there are 9 Hunter-class Type 26-based variant frigates to be built in Adelaide by BAE and their partners, including the ASC, and that was a very exciting decision for South Australia. And then when you add the extremely exciting opportunity of constructing submarines that now will be nuclear-propelled submarines in Adelaide, we are unquestionably the major naval shipbuilding hub of at least the Southern Hemisphere, and in some metrics one of the largest and most diverse naval shipbuilding capabilities on the planet. There are not too many shipyards anywhere that are building the variety of vessels that we have the capability to build in Adelaide. And in the last decade or so, naval shipbuilding capability has completely consolidated to my home city of Adelaide, my home state of South Australia. And it wouldn't surprise the chamber to know I'm obviously very excited about that. And that is an enormous opportunity from an industry point of view to my home state. But what it also underscores is the significance and how far we've come when it comes to sovereign capability in naval shipbuilding. Because we will have, in the Royal Australian Navy, every vessel and any decisions into the future, I'm confident, will also involve national sovereign construction here in this nation, centred in Adelaide. What that means is the Royal Australian Navy's capability is all sovereignly constructed, sovereignly maintained, and means that whilst we're very committed to the alliances that we have that are very important to us, that the fundamental capability of the Royal Australian Navy relies on no one but the people of this country, and that none of the decisions that might need to be made from a national security point of view in the interests of our country are ever going to be reliant on anyone else other than our sovereign capability. And that is what this debate is about, in taking note of that statement. We've obviously all made contributions in committing towards the bipartisan imperative of sovereign capability of our national security. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't want to take the opportunity of acquiring the absolute best capability that is available. And we are very lucky, and it's one of the very significant elements of our important alliances, particularly now within the AUKUS framework, that we will always seek to get the best capability and the best technology for our armed forces, both those that technology that's developed here and that is available from our major allies and partners. And the United States and the United Kingdom, of course, have made the decision through the AUKUS structure to provide us with an unbelievable capability that we would have no ability to develop ourselves, which is the nuclear propulsion of submarines for the future submarine capability in our Navy. And that is a great example of the benefit of that. But we're equally proud of the technology and the research and development and the capability that we are creating here in Australia. And we are obviously a valued partner to a nation like the United States, evidenced by their decision to entrust us with this very closely guarded technology around nuclear propulsion and also the other partnerships that we have with them. But the most important thing is that they are also entrusting us, and we are working with them on developing capability to manufacture that capability here in Australia and have the sovereignty underpinned by that local domestic capability. And we're also investing and ensuring that the industry in the defence sector here in Australia is capable of meeting those needs and is producing all of that capability here in Australia. I've got some great defence firms in my electorate, like all members no doubt have got those stories of SMEs, businesses that people have created, that are employing people and that are contributing into the supply chains that are providing that national security capability of the highest standard, but are also getting the economic dividend that is very important also with the enormous amount of expenditure involved in defence capability here within the Australian economy. We want to always make sure that we've got the highest standard of capability, but we also want to make sure that from both a national security point of view and an economic point of view, that the enormous amount of investment that we're making is giving the most significant economic dividend, and also that we've got the security from a national security point of view of having that capability within our nation so that we're never reliant on anyone else except for ourselves. And that is something that I'm very confident will always be bipartisan in this place and in all the major discussions and debates we have. I'm very confident that there will always be a complete consensus on the importance of Australia having the capability to make our own decisions in our own interests without having to rely on anyone else. That is what sovereignty is all about, and on that basis I commend this motion to the House.
I thank the member. The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Solomon.
Yeah, thanks, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak to Defence Minister Miles's ministerial statement on securing Australia's sovereignty. As previous speakers have alluded to, securing our sovereignty is the government's top priority. It is the capacity of a people, our people, through their government to determine the circumstances, or their own circumstances, free from coercion. It underpins every other public good that the state delivers, from essential services to our economic growth and from our secure borders to meaningful action on climate change. And while it is not the only one, defence capability is a key determinant of sovereignty. In a world where the threat of armed conflict is less remote and foreign interference is more prevalent than ever, it has never been more important to guard our sovereignty. Deputy Speaker, this is urgent because we face the most difficult circumstances strategically since the Second World War. Add to that, or an example of that, is that Russia's illegal and immoral war in Ukraine gives us daily proof that industrial war, large-scale war, is no longer a thing of the past, as we had all hoped following the carnage of the Second World War. And in our region, the Indo-Pacific, we see large military build-ups rivalling any in the post-war period. We are also seeing increasing strategic competition with a more assertive China seeking to shape the world around it in our region. And grey zone activities that do bring tensions to our shores, so that we now live in a less safe and a less stable world. This is why we must ensure the security of our strategic geography in our region, and also the viability of our trading and supply routes. And it is why we must work with like-minded countries, partners, and our United States ally. Our partnerships represent a network of states that reinforce norms, principles and the rules-based system to ensure a free, open and, of course, prosperous Indo-Pacific. Our government, the Albanese government, is strengthening our partnerships with not only the US, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, India, but also PNG, Indonesia, ASEAN, the ASEAN Group, and the Quad. And while all these relationships strengthen Australia's sovereignty by maximising our influence, today I would like to take this opportunity to speak to our US ally, which has been central to our national security since the 1940s. The Labor Party is proud to have led the wartime government that laid the alliance's modern foundations during the Pacific War. And our 1951 alliance with the United States is one of the most important bipartisan achievements of Australian diplomacy and one that enjoys broad public approval. Now, our government is committed to building on that record. A significant step change in our security cooperation with the United States was the establishment of the bilateral force posture initiatives by the Gillard government in 2011. This began with the first rotation of US Marines to Darwin, which has ramped up to the full rotation strength of 2,500 troops. I'm sure honourable members will remember when President Obama visited Darwin. We certainly do in my electorate of Solomon. Successive Australian governments have held the view that a strong and active US military presence in the Indo-Pacific is vital for deterring threats to the stability of the region. And there is one development in the alliance that is hard to miss, namely that it is becoming increasingly Australianised. What I mean by that is the alliance is growing more visible on Australian soil and above all in the north of our country, and above all in the Northern Territory, and above all in Darwin. I've already mentioned the ongoing deployment of Marines to Darwin, which was expanded at the 2022 AUSMIN meeting in Washington DC to include rotations of US Army, US Navy and US Air Force elements, including bombers and fighters, training out of Australian bases over the coming years. Tyndall near Katherine being foremost among those bases. AUSMIN communiques are worth paying attention to because they function as the shared to-do list, if you like, of our alliance. The latest one committed the Allies to supporting enhanced US force posture by co-developing Northern Australian BEAR bases and associated infrastructure, including runway improvements, parking aprons, fuel infrastructure, explosive ordnance storage infrastructure and facilities to support the workforce. An example of this is the stockpiling of jet fuel at a US-owned storage facility in Darwin. These force posture initiatives, which Japan has been invited to participate in, strengthen Australia's security, which in turn increases America's ability to deter blatant challenges to the rules-based order of the kind we see in Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. And as the 2022 communique states, Australia and America are concerned by excessive maritime claims in our region that are inconsistent with international law. As Australia's strategic real estate increases in significance to our great and powerful American allies, so does our alliance continue to deepen. I see this trend continuing over the next decade for essentially geopolitical and geostrategic reasons, and America's force posture initiatives in the region respond to their need to disperse forces and to not over-rely on its bases in other nations in our region. South Korea, Japan and Guam being examples that face growing limitations, but Darwin and our other northern and southern Australian bases offer good options, safer options for our allied forces to consider. It would be wrong to reduce the alliance to this simple arithmetic, but it is undeniably helping to shape its future. Our trilateral AUKUS partnership with the US and the UK is the next chapter in our strategic cooperation. The strongest deterrent and strategic effect Australia can hope to contribute to the alliance is no doubt the acquisition of a nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarine force. This was not its only promise, which also included long-range strike capabilities, but it was the main thrust of the 2021 AUKUS technology sharing agreement between Australia, the UK and the US. Obviously, this was not a bilateral deal with our US ally only, but it must inevitably be understood in the context of the alliance. While the UK is an extremely close defence partner and not a treaty ally, these submarines are highly likely to operate in an alliance framework. Far from increasing our dependence, as some argue, AUKUS will strengthen Australia's sovereignty by delivering nuclear-powered but conventionally armed submarines. Deputy Speaker, to update the House, in January 2023, I led a State Department-sponsored visit to the United States by a bipartisan delegation of members and senators in my capacity as the chair of the Parliamentary Friends of the US. It was clear to me that in the United States of America there's increasing fondness and a realisation of the importance of us within the alliance, and it is in good shape. Thanks, Deputy Speaker.
I thank the member, and I call the member for who's coming? Reid, or who's coming? Macon. Macon. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it's always interesting listening to the member for Solomon because he certainly knows what he's talking about when he talks about defence because of his experience through his own service. Mr. Deputy Speaker, last Thursday the Deputy Prime Minister made a ministerial statement entitled Securing Australia's Sovereignty. It was an important statement that outlined Australia's national security and sovereign capability. We heard today that the Defence Strategic Review has now been handed to government, and I'm sure that that review will add to those very issues, and I'm sure we'll also be hearing more about it. But I want to quote three phrases from the Deputy Prime Minister's statement last week. The first is, and I quote, "The world around us is uncertain." Secondly, he said, "We now live in a less safe and less stable world." And thirdly, he said, "Our partnerships build our national capability and security." Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'll come back to some of that if time permits, but I think that those statements sum up very well the issues that we are confronted with and how we are to respond if we're going to strengthen our national security and sovereign capability. National security and defence, when we think of those two words, the first image that I suspect comes to most of us is the image of the men and women in uniform serving in the Army, Navy and Air Force. They enlist in a dangerous service for our country and for our people. We honour their lives, their service and their sacrifices through numerous services throughout the year, with Anzac Day, I believe, now being Australia's most significant national day. We honour their service with a world-class National War Memorial, probably the most visited national facility we have in Australia, and the regular last post services held there. Today, on the 14th of February, we also honour and remember those people who were referred to as NASHOs, caught up as part of National Servicemen's Day, when as a nation we think about the 280,000 plus who were called up to serve between 1951 and 1972. More than 15,000 of them served in Vietnam, where I understand that more than 200 lost their lives and around 1,200 were wounded. In my own region, The National Servicemen's Association of Australia, South Australian Para-Districts Branch, has for years provided a friendship and support group for the Nashos. Over the years, I've had a close association with the Para-District Branch, and I've not only learnt so much from them, but I've also made some very good friends from amongst those Nashos. This Sunday, the 19th of February, I know that there will be commemoration services remembering the bombing of Darwin on the 19th of February in 1942, and which then went on for, I think, some months until November of 1943. And in that bombing, again, perhaps the worst mainland attack we've experienced in this country, at least 236 people were killed, perhaps a lot more. It's difficult to get the precise statistics, and some 400 were wounded. And again, as a nation, we commemorate those people who served and lost their lives and made sacrifices. Within my own community and my own region, particularly in Mawson Lakes, at Edinburgh and at the Australian Submarine Corporation, we have hundreds of defence-related industries and have had for some years. And I note that other members who have contributed to this debate have referred to South Australia's contribution to our national defence and the number of defence-related industries that we have in South Australia. Amongst those industries and within those industries, we have world-leading expertise and knowledge. And I've been through several of them. I've listened to their presentations. I've looked at what they do and how they contribute to global affairs through their expertise. And it never ceases to amaze me how well and how important their work is. It is work and know-how that is complemented by dozens of manufacturing firms who equally have expert skills and capability. And they are also critical to Australia's sovereign capability. Because, Mr Deputy Speaker, we cannot secure our country without a strong manufacturing sector. Regrettably, under the last coalition government, our manufacturing sector was crippled, and certainly that was the case in South Australia when the coalition government turned their back on the Australian car makers. They then offshored defence manufacturing. In doing that, what they did is that it led to a loss of so much engineering skills, specialist trade skills and design, and even some science skills that not only benefited the car makers and the defence industries and so on, but it benefited the broader community and other manufacturers throughout the country. And their research and development dollars that were also lost had a flow-on effect right throughout this country. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, maintaining a strong manufacturing sector is as critical as putting together all the other components of trying to secure our country and making sure that we have the strategic capability to do so. Mr Deputy Speaker, we just had a debate in the main chamber about defence spending in this country. And can I say this with respect to the last coalition government? We hear a lot about their commitment to defence spending in this country. The reality is this, that in the last 9 years under which they were in government, our submarine program, which was a critical issue at the time they came to office, ended with the wastage of over $5 billion on this French contract, which went nowhere. And at the change of government 9 years later, we did not even have a contract in place to replace our submarines. Now, I stress that point for this reason. Only the other day I made a 90-second statement about the importance of maintaining a workforce in the defence area. A workforce with absolutely specialist skills that we cannot afford to lose, because as we were told by leaders from that workforce. Many of those skills take many years to develop. It is not just simply a case of doing an apprenticeship and then you're able to work within those industries. After the apprenticeship, you need to go into the sector and do some real work to actually further develop your skills. And if we don't have a continuous build in our naval construction, then those skills will be lost. Already many of them are, and it has been claimed that in order to rebuild our naval construction workforce, we need to start finding skills from elsewhere. But the reality is that we need to ensure that there is continuous work. And we will only do that if we get on with building our naval requirements here in Australia and we have a continuous build in place. That message has been told to this parliament loud and clear for year on year, and regrettably it seems that it is sliding away. Now, under the Albanese government, we have recommitted to rebuilding Australia's manufacturing sector. And we've done that through the National Reconstruction Fund. That fund goes to the heart of rebuilding Australia's manufacturing capability. But again, what are we seeing? We're seeing the opposition opposing the establishment of that fund and opposing the very purpose for which it has been designed and the programs that it will sustain, which I would have thought the opposition would have seen were in the national interest. Regrettably, that is not the case. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, it seems to me that if we are going to rebuild our national manufacturing capability, which goes to the heart of securing our national security and our defence capability, then we need to get behind that fund.
I thank the member. The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Dunkley. The question is that the debate be adjourned. All those of that opinion say aye. All those against say no. The ayes have it. I call the clerk.
Government business, order of the day number 2, resumption of debate on the motion related to the anniversary of the apology to the stolen generations.
The question is that the document be noted, and I call the member for Gellibrand.
Thank you, Speaker. Well, Monday marked 15 years since Prime Minister Kevin Rudd issued the apology to the stolen generations. It was 15 years since the nation offered a formal apology to our First Nations peoples, which acknowledged that, quote, the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments had resulted in the forcible removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families and inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these, our fellow Australians. It was a profound moment for this place and for our nation. It was a moment where, as a nation, we could collectively acknowledge the wrongdoings of our predecessors and start to look together towards the future. It was a moment where, collectively, we told the truth. Now, the apology 15 years ago was just a step on the path of reconciliation. As the Prime Minister has said, one of the greatest achievements of the apology was to, quote, keep the faith in the decency and the hope for reconciliation that will illustrate the Uluru Statement from the heart alive. It paved the way for the next steps on our national journey of reconciliation: voice, treaty and truth. Now, I want to say a few words about this anniversary in my role as Australia's Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs, because this journey, this national journey of reconciliation, frames the way that the world sees Australia. And in framing the way that the rest of the world sees Australia, it underlies and underpins our influence internationally. Gough Whitlam recognised this as Prime Minister when, in 1972, he said in a significant foreign policy speech that, quote, more than any foreign aid program, more than any international obligation which we meet or forfeit, more than any part we may play in any treaty or agreement or alliance, Australia's treatment of her Aboriginal people was the thing upon which the rest of the world would judge it. Whitlam was right, and as Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs, I can see how other nations with similar histories to ours, similar colonial paths, are further along this path of national reconciliation with their First Nations people, particularly when it comes to constitutional recognition. New Zealand, Canada, Finland, Sweden, Norway, all democracies comparable to our own, they all have structures in place to represent First Nations people. In comparison, Australia is an outlier. We sit alone without the formalised recognition of First Nations people. So it's no surprise in this context that the Albanese government's commitment to the full implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, our work to enshrine both constitutional recognition of our First Nations people and a First Nations voice to Parliament, has not been lost on our international counterparts. The Albanese government understands that we need to incorporate the 60,000 years of Indigenous wisdom present in our nation, the gift that all of us have inherited when we engage with our international partners. And that's why we're progressing a First Nations foreign policy, centring Indigenous perspectives and voices and practices in the way that we engage with the rest of the world. As part of this, we're appointing an ambassador for First Nations peoples. And I've seen how this isn't just a nice-to-do thing, it's not a piece of PR, it's really deepened our engagement with other countries and the First Nations peoples in other countries, and it's really shaping the way that those countries view Australia. We know that we need to harness the knowledge of the world's oldest continuing culture when we engage with the world. But some nations that we compete with in our region like to portray Australia as a colonial outpost, out of place in our own region. Now, the process of constitutional recognition of First Nations Australia, the implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the Voice to Parliament puts paid to this lie. It shows the ability of our nation, of our political system, to change, to grow, to become a greater nation tomorrow than we were yesterday, to recognise and address the mistakes of our past. This process of national growth and evolution, it's a living demonstration of the strength of our nation as an evolving society and country, and of the strength of our political system. It's a comparative advantage of our democracy to be able to recognise mistakes and to change course, to set off on a more positive, inclusive course. Now, I've personally seen the enormous interest in Australia's process of Indigenous First Nations constitutional recognition firsthand in my travels as Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs. I've seen it firsthand, particularly in regions like Africa and South America, that there's substantial interest in our process to appoint a voice to Parliament. Now, I think this is important because, among the many reasons for the voice, constitutional recognition is fundamental to ensuring our international counterparts see us for who we are, a proud and diverse country which lays claim to over 300 different ethnicities, a country that embodies what Noel Pearson has described as the three stories that make us one as Australians: the tens of thousands of years of continuous Indigenous culture, the Westminster traditions that followed, and the multicultural migration that has enriched our society in recent decades. You cannot tell the one story of Australia without telling these three stories. And as Noel Pearson has said it, together these three stories tell an epic. But our job as political leaders, our job as parliamentarians, is to bring these three stories together into the one national story. The process of the implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and particularly the referendum that we will hold this year to enshrine the voice to Parliament in our Constitution, is an important moment to bring together these three stories of Australia. It's an important moment of nation building. It's a great obligation on our part, and I see it as part of the continuum from the apology that we saw 15 years ago in this building to the implementation of the voice to Parliament. It's important that we trace the history of the voice to Parliament. When the Constitutional Recognition Committee, when Indigenous Australians got together, to consider how they wanted to be recognised in our Constitution, how they wanted to be recognised in the birth certificate of our nation. They did not want a mere symbolic recognition. They didn't want to be simply included in the preamble of our Constitution. They didn't want a ticker box exercise. They wanted something substantive. And what they came up with, the consensus ask that they came up with, was the Uluru Statement from the Heart and was the voice to Parliament. It's a great gift that we have been given, a gift that is an opportunity for nation building. In my community in Melbourne's West, we are very proud to be the home of that wonderful, outstanding Indigenous leader, William Cooper, who lived in Footscray, and his magnificent mustachioed visage is visible from the Footscray train station for everyone commuting into the CBD. And William Cooper, he wasn't just a trade unionist, he wasn't just a pastor. He was an advocate that was before his time. His ideas were before their time. And in the 1930s, he called for land rights, but he also called for direct representation of Indigenous voices representing Indigenous peoples in this building in the 1930s. He included that in a petition to the Prime Minister and later to the King. And we can clearly see the echoes in that petition, that desire for an Indigenous First Nations voice in our Constitution, in our Parliament, in William Cooper's advocacy in the 1930s. This is part of Noel Pearson's story of the great epic of Australia, but it's incumbent on us to take it forward. And what I would suggest to colleagues is that while the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the Voice to Parliament are a great opportunity to tell that epic story of Australia to the rest of the world, to grow our reputation, to show the ability of our country to grow and become ever greater, there's also a risk. And that if we fail to grasp this moment, if as a nation, if as parliamentarians, we fail to rise to meet this moment, to seize this opportunity for nation building, we will be judged very harshly in the eyes of the international community who are watching our journey. I think it's incumbent on all of us to realise the scale of the opportunity before us and the gravity of us, and to put aside the petty things that sometimes dominate the discussion in this building. To take the guidance of the apology 15 years ago, that very significant moment, and to take that shared unity of purpose together towards the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the Voice to Parliament. Thank you, Speaker.
And I thank the Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs. The question is that the document be noted, and I give the call to the member for Warringah.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak in response to the 15th anniversary of the apology to the stolen generations and the introduction of the latest Closing the Gap implementation plan. In doing so, I acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri elders of the Canberra region where Parliament gathers. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of my area in Warringah, where I speak from. Their names remain contested, but they are part of the longest surviving culture in the world. And in acknowledging them, I acknowledge too their sorrow and the cost of sharing this land, and I commit myself to genuine healing. And I acknowledge that the land was never ceded. I commend the Albanese government's commitment to closing the gap for Indigenous Australians and support the 2023 implementation plan introduced on Monday, accompanied by the $420 million of new funding for practical action. The implementation plan represents an important step forwards enacting the promises made by this government. The government must emphasise that working with Indigenous people on policies which will affect them. That is so important. I firmly believe that the voice will be a vital contribution to future Closing the Gap implementation plans and other policies impacting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The success of Closing the Gap must be determined by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities themselves. The review of the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, third review, tells us that as a government and as a parliament, we need to move away from giving updates and seeking endorsement towards enabling and sharing decision-making. The progress of some targets in the plan continue to go backwards, including children's school readiness, child removal rates and incarceration rates. We need to work on coordination across related areas like alcohol and drugs and health and mental health, and look at the links between sectors such as housing and unemployment or health. We need to listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander local groups and hear their feedback, work on engaging with grassroots communities. It is just so clear that while progress has been made in some areas following the 2008 apology, the Australian governments along the way have really failed to truly close the gap in so many, just such drastic areas. And so while so many in our communities are faced this year with the question of the referendum and the voice, it's important that people remember where we are at. Child removals. In fact, in 2020, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children represented around 37% of children in Australia living away from their families. That is increasing at a staggering rate. So whilst we celebrate the apology to stolen generations that shocked so many to understand the rate at which the practice of removing children from their families, to know that in 2020 we still have a rate, an overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children being removed says something that this is not working. To compare, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children represent about 6% of the total population of children in Australia. So 6% of the population, but 37% of the children living away from families. The number of Indigenous children being removed from their homes has increased over the past decade. Of these children, there are those who are adopted, are usually placed with non-Indigenous families, removing them from culture and community. We must acknowledge the fact that the number of Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care is now greater than those removed during the decades of the stolen generation. That is just quite a staggering fact. And obviously it's indicative that there's serious flaw in our system. What we're doing isn't working. Raising the age of criminal responsibility. To illustrate this differently, 65% of children aged between 10 and 13 held in juvenile justice systems are Indigenous. Our government currently invests far more in out-of-home care support, taking children to live away from their families, than they do in actually solving the issues that lead to child removal. It's also the product of the fact of the age of criminal responsibility. In the majority of states and territories, the country is still only 10 years of age, and there has been debate and some progress towards raising it to 12. But the recommendation is 14, and I urge the government to increase the age of responsibility to at least 14 years of age to bring us more in line with international standards and reduce the contact of our youth with the criminal justice system. We know that this is the beginning of a spiral, of a journey that doesn't end well. And by having such a low age of criminal responsibility, it discriminates, and it absolutely, Indigenous youth are overrepresented. The story of Do One from the documentary In My Blood It Runs is truly heart-wrenching, and his plea to the United Nations in 2019 highlighted that raising the age would make a huge difference. The rate of recidivism from those locked up at such an early age is huge. This was made plain in the report released late last year by the Attorney-General at the Standing Council of Attorney-Generals. And I quote, "Studies have shown that the younger the child is when first having contact with the justice system, the more likely they are to go on to reoffend," it says. The key recommendation of that report was to raise the age to 14. The states have committed to a plan to raise the age to 12, which many experts claim will be virtually meaningless. It's pretty simple. Children belong in classrooms and playgrounds, not in handcuffs, courtrooms and prison cells. And I'm not excusing where there are instances of civil unrest and difficulty, but we know the current approach is not working. Underlying factors. Ultimately, these statistics are a product of the government's and successive governments' historical failure to intervene early enough to prevent intergenerational trauma. Without concrete action being taken to close the gap, the government will likely look back on our time period marked by so much child removal and will be apologising again. Child removals are just one example of the issues facing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Many Australians did not know the extent of the removals occurring during the stolen generations, or shocked in 2008 when the apology was done by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. But we must acknowledge the statistics we have access to surrounding child removals and other issues today, and the fact that they are still so bad, or we risk these issues continuing and getting worse. So why the voice matters in this context is just so clear. The voice to Parliament would represent a step in the right direction. It is the next step towards our reconciliation. The National Agreement on Closing the Gap's priority reform number 4 aims for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have access to and the capability to use locally relevant data and information to set and monitor the implementation of efforts to close the gap, their priorities, and drive their own development. This must embody how we pursue the implementation plan and the voice to Parliament. Indigenous representation in Parliament will prove instrumental in achieving the goals set out in the Implementation Plan 2023, and it will aid the government's continued mission to close the gap. As a country, we have become far better at acknowledging our Indigenous heritage and of celebrating it. I mean, we are just a lucky country in that we have the oldest living continuous culture in the world, some 65,000 years. It really boggles the mind to even stop to think about it. And yet we are still so far from truly recognising it, acknowledging it and celebrating it. We need to get much, much better at the crucial step of inclusion and engagement, of providing genuine opportunity and optimism for our Indigenous people. For Indigenous, so many communities, their history is ultimately Australia's history. By improving their lives and outcomes, we improve all our lives and outcomes. And that's why it is with excitement but trepidation that we engage this year in this process of conversation and listening when it comes to the referendum and finally achieving constitutional recognition. I would remind so many that when the Constitution was drafted, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were not included. They were not consulted. They were not in any way referred to. And that is an omission that needs to be fixed. It is a very basic step. So it is with trepidation that I think this year we're going to have a conversation as Australians, a mature conversation of what kind of nation we want to be. We can't undo the wrongs of the past. We can't change them. But we can certainly decide what kind of Australia we want to be in the future. And I have a deep, deep faith that we can be a much better Australia. Thank you.
And I thank the member for Warringah. The question is that the document be noted, and I give the call to the member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And in rising to speak on the anniversary of the apology to the stolen generations, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples of the Canberra region, as well as the Indigenous people from my electorate of Chisholm, the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people. And what a significant week in the life of our parliament and our nation this has been, with a cross-parliamentary Friends of the Uluru Statement and, of course, the national apology to the stolen generations. The occasion this week of the occasion 15 years ago of the national apology to the stolen generations on the 13th of February in 2008 was and remains a momentous day in our country's history and in the process of healing that is necessary to walk towards real reconciliation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. While state and territory governments had already made their own apologies for the violence and harm rendered through the stolen generation before 2008, it took Kevin Rudd's election as Prime Minister in 2007 to see a national apology. This apology came after the harrowing Bringing Them Home inquiry and report, which heard from hundreds of people, over 500 people, who had been impacted by the forced child removal and assimilation, which had been government policy. It was brave and it was generous for those who participated to share their stories, often very painful stories, with the inquiry. And it was only right that their words, their stories, and unfortunately their trauma could lead to taking the next step towards healing. It's an unfortunate truth that children's homes in my own electorate, long gone now, were sites of horror, and I'm very sorry that that happened in our community. When I was at school, I remember the debate around whether the stolen generation should be apologised for by the government, and to the extent to which it was even bad. Now, when I visit schools, and it's one of my favourite parts of the job, it's clear that the apology is now embraced by young people as a turning point in our nation. And the history of First Nations people is not sanitised. The brutal truths are known, but also the 60,000 years of continuous culture in this country of First Nations people that is taught and that is celebrated. In a similar vein to the way the apology opened up a pathway for reconciliation, for understanding and for healing, our nation now has the opportunity with the Voice referendum to continue down that pathway and ensure constitutional recognition for our First People and to really listen to First Nations people in this country. The work of this nation will not end once the referendum to enshrine a voice is voted on, even with a yes vote. This is just another step on the journey towards reconciliation, towards better outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, towards closing the gap. The Voice is the first part of implementing the Uluru Statement of the Heart, which we are committed to as a Labor government: voice, treaty, truth. Our nation does have a way to go to ensure that on critical measures, including infant mortality and life expectancy, there are improvements for First Nations people. The statistics on health outcomes, educational outcomes, are not good enough for First Nations people, and there needs to be more done in relation with the justice system to ensure that there is not a disproportionate number of First Nations people incarcerated. We must do better. The Voice is a step towards a better nation. The national apology too was a leap forward in our healing journey. For all those impacted by the stolen generation, by government policies that sought to separate children from families and from culture, I'm sorry. And it is right that 15 years later, we are still sorry as a nation. I hope that people across this country make the decision to be on what I believe is the right side of history and vote for constitutional recognition and an Indigenous voice to Parliament. I hope we as a nation can take the next step towards reconciliation, towards better outcomes and justice for First Nations people in our country, and for a stronger Australia for all of us. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
And I thank the member for Chisholm. The question is that the document be noted, and I give the call to the member for Curtin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak in response to the 15th anniversary of the apology to the stolen generation and the introduction of the latest Closing the Gap implementation plan. I'm not going to reiterate the statistics about Aboriginal disadvantage, which we all know. Instead, I want to share what I've learnt about why symbols like the apology and the voice are important and indeed practical. I started working as Aboriginal Affairs Manager at Wesfarmers about the time of the national apology to the stolen generation and the commitment to close the gap. At the time, I don't think I realised how significant it was. I now realise that more than half of the adult Aboriginal population in Western Australia is either stolen generation or descendants of the stolen generation. This was not a historical issue, it was a very real and current open wound. At the time, I came to the issue with a fairly corporate way of thinking. Then I saw the apology as a symbol, a good symbol, but just a symbol. I now understand why it was much more than that and why symbols are vital. The commitment to partnership and accountability around closing the gap fit better with my corporate framework of measuring your key performance indicators and managing to them. Since then, I've seen the bureaucratic knots we tie ourselves in the layers of closing the gap documents and structures, but committing to quantitative targets meant that we've had to accept our failures as well as our modest successes. As the Aboriginal Affairs Manager at Wesfarmers Limited, that was the largest private sector employer at the country, and I was on a steep learning curve about Aboriginal history and culture, guided by some wonderfully wise Noongar leaders. Like so many others on that journey, the more I learned about Aboriginal history and culture, the more I realised I didn't know, and the more I questioned my own culture. I had a number of moments on my cultural awareness journey that were characterised by the feeling of having the rug pulled out from under me. Moments when I realised that all that I confidently believed to be true was a bit shaky. It made me question so many of my own assumptions. I'm talking about this because I think it's deeply relevant to how we now think of milestones like the Apology and the upcoming Voice. My experiences helped me understand why this was important to First Nations people and that maybe they were onto something. Here's what I learned. The Noongar people in the southwest of WA recognise 6 seasons during the year. They see the weather, plants and animals change every year through this cycle, from Mukuru, the season of fertility, Jilba, the season of conception, Kambarang, birth, Birak, childhood, Bunuroo, adolescence, Djerran, maturity, and back to Mukuru, fertility again. After I'd been working with Aboriginal people for a while, I heard from someone...
The member for Curtin will resume her seat. It being 6:30 p.m, the debate is interrupted in accordance with Standing Order 192B. The debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of the day for the next sitting. The member for Curtin will have leave to continue speaking when the debate is resumed on a future day. And I call the clerk.
Government business, order of the day number 3, grievance debate.
The question before the House is that grievances be noted, and I give the call to the member for Ryan.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Like other Ryan residents, I know that traffic and travel can be an enormous daily challenge. Congestion, travel times and poor connectivity and frequency of public transport all affect the people of Ryan every day. Many have raised these issues with me. Federal money goes into transport via black spot safety funding and support for specific infrastructure projects. I believe the federal government should have a greater role in funding transport solutions so people can spend less time in traffic and more time with their families, and so our environments can be cleaner and our places more accessible for all. My team and I recently conducted a comprehensive transport survey in Ryan, and the enthusiastic uptake and the results were very telling. We asked about congestion, about street safety, public transport, footpaths and cycleways. The comprehensive and thoughtful responses have inspired me to propose solutions around how all levels of government could collaborate on broad positive change to answer transport issues in Ryan and beyond. The motivations for this survey, and indeed for urgent action, are manifold. Petrol prices, like the cost of everything, are going through the roof, and transport costs are a growing strain. Australian households every year spend over $50 billion on petrol, with the average Brisbane household spending $458.38 weekly in total on transport. Increasing road congestion causes many hours lost every day to sitting in traffic. Main roads in Ryan are amongst the most congested in Brisbane. Transport is the third largest and, in fact, the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions in Australia, with emissions from cars and light commercial vehicles contributing 11.6% of annual emissions. In Ryan, which is quite representative of many Australian conditions, from dense inner urban areas to outer suburban to rural and bushland zones, and a broad socio-economic spread, our survey found that over 55% of people reported driving as their main mode of transport to get to work or school drop-off or pick-up. So it's no wonder that a whopping 93% of people reported road congestion. Unfortunately, only 32% of people take public transport and 13% use active transport methods like walking or cycling. But unfortunately, as we uncovered in our survey, there are many barriers to the uptake of public transport. Inaccessibility, lack of connectivity, inadequate frequency of services, and not least cost are all impediments to public transport use. In many areas of Ryan, and indeed Australia, it's simply not safe to cycle or walk. It's clear to me that a robust public transport network would take cars off the road, reduce congestion and carbon emissions, and should be less expensive than travel by private car. Win-win. This is what we used to call in my previous professional life a triple bottom line solution. There was agreement across Ryan that we need to move on this. So how do we get there? What are the current barriers to people using public transport? Myriad. Our survey respondents reported fundamental problems with our public transport network, with nearly half of respondents rating public transport as poor or very poor. People said the system isn't connected enough, there aren't enough stops near where people live, and the services don't go to where people actually want to go. The system is inaccessible in places. We're still waiting for the Queensland Government, for example, to move on train station upgrades in Taringa. Services aren't frequent enough. An overwhelming 70% of people said that fares are too expensive. So how could we reduce congestion and carbon emissions without building expensive infrastructure? Making public transport free would be a great way to increase uptake. Crucially, in a cost of living crisis, families would save money on petrol, parking and fares. The federal government could implement funding agreements with each of the states to release federal funds on the condition that states deliver their public transport systems for free. Public transport is already heavily subsidised by state governments. For example, in Brisbane, fares have covered less than 20% of operating expenses since 2016, and that includes covering the cost of privatised ticketing systems that enforce the fares. So, it's not a radical idea, I believe, to fill in the funding gap that's currently covered by fares and make transport free for everyone to use. The people of Ryan agree. 72% of survey respondents supported the idea that the federal government should trial a period of free public transport across the country. And alongside this, making active transport safer and more attractive for people can make a huge difference. 64% of people say that cycling is fairly or very unsafe, and it's no wonder that people aren't cycling more. Only about 1 in 20 people think that their local area is very safe for cyclists. Our survey showed that 83% of people support more government investment for safe cycling infrastructure. So over the next few months, I'll be advocating for broad systemic changes, as well as liaising with other levels of government for action on some of the specific issues that were brought up in the survey. The recommendations I've made based on the results are as follows: that council and state government should collaborate with locals on integrated transport plans around schools, maximising safety and public and active transport usage. We should investigate the possibility of undertaking a federally funded trial of free public transport. We need to connect and expand safe cycleways on the west side. Some, but not all, key locations have state or local government projects already underway or in consultation. And on the 1st of April, I'll be joining Greens state member for Maywar, Michael Berkman MP, for a community bike ride to advocate completing the Indooroopilly Bikeway. We need more local public services and facilities, including a new school in the Moggle-Bellbowrie area, to relieve congestion from school traffic on Moggle Road. The recent bus network review by Brisbane City Council has neglected the west side. We need an expansion of funding to improve routes, including updating or extending current routes and turning key routes into high-frequency services. We need a full accessibility review for the west side, with the findings to inform train station upgrades, bus stops and footpaths. Addressing these fundamental issues will bring enormous benefits to the community and to the environment. And it's something that all levels of government should be collaborating on, and I look forward to what we can achieve together. Thank you.
And I thank the member for Ryan. The question is that grievances be noted, and I give the call to the member for Lyons.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Before the House right now are two very big pieces of legislation: the Housing Australia Future Fund Bill and the National Reconstruction Fund Corporation Bill 2022. These two bills represent two key planks of the Albanese Labor government's election platform to address the nation's housing affordability and homelessness crisis and to strengthen the country's sovereign manufacturing capabilities. Together, the bills will put $25 billion into reserve funds, the proceeds of which will be used to fund various initiatives. You wouldn't think that this would be controversial. Both measures were key planks of our election platform. Both measures address key pressure points in our economy. But the Liberals are opposing them. The Liberals are opposing an initiative that will, over 5 years, build 20,000 affordable and social homes, 4,000 of which will be reserved for women and children fleeing domestic violence and older women at risk of homelessness. The Liberals are opposing the provision of 10,000 homes for frontline workers such as police, nurses and cleaners who are being priced out of being able to live near where they work. The Liberals are opposing the National Reconstruction Fund, a manufacturing fund that will back thousands of jobs in our regions. Now, the Liberals often talk about sovereign borders, but they seem to have no idea about the importance of sovereign capability. We know from the pandemic the importance of making more things in Australia so we are less dependent on global supply chains, which can all too easily be broken. This Labor government wants to value add our raw materials. We don't want to dig up our critical minerals and simply ship them offshore for processing. We want to turn them into finished products here at home. We want to back our brightest minds so they don't feel they need to go overseas. If we mine it here, we should make it here. If we invent it here, we should make it here. And yet, the Liberals are simply not on board. They are running the same arguments against the NRF that they used to run when they opposed Labor's creation of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation 10 years ago. Never mind that the CFEC has invested $11 billion and leveraged $2.61 of private sector investment against every dollar of government funding. It's been a success by any measure. But that does not matter to the Liberals, who under opposition leader Peter Dutton are channeling the oppose everything blueprint of Tony Abbott. In doing so, they clearly have decided to put their own narrow ideological and political interests ahead of the national interest. Unfortunately, Deputy Speaker, it's not just the coalition, or the no-alition, as they've been referred to in the main House. The Greens too, I'm sad to say, are playing cute with the housing legislation. If they join with the coalition in the Senate, it makes it much more difficult for the government to get this package through the Senate. My message to the Greens is this: think of the First Nations people, the women, the domestic violence victim survivors, who will continue to suffer if this legislation is not passed by this parliament. The parliamentary process is not a game, nor an opportunity to horse trade whenever you see fit. The stakes in this place are Australian lives. Deputy Speaker, frankly, I'm tired of being lectured to by Greens MPs who come into the parliament to tell us to do more about affordable housing, while Greens on councils around the country oppose projects that would provide more affordable housing. They come into this place demanding action, but do nothing to demand from their own colleagues that Greens-dominated councils get behind affordable housing projects. Deputy Speaker, both housing and national reconstruction were key planks of Labor's election platform last year. We could not have been clearer with our intentions. And yet the Liberals, and I hope the Greens come on board, but certainly the Liberals have said they're opposed to this, remain opposed. And they stood right here in this parliament so many years ago and baited the Australian car industry into leaving this country. And you know what? That's exactly what the car industry did. They left, taking with them components, capabilities, the manufacturing abilities, the skills, the know-how. We've lost it all. We've lost that sovereign capability to manufacture motor vehicles. The NRF's investment decisions will be independent, Deputy Speaker, and it's important that we say this because for too long, while those opposite were in government, decisions were made in the interests of the coalition and their mates, not in the wider interests of the national interest. The focus of this government is on renewing, revitalising, rebuilding Australia's manufacturing industry for Australians, for small business owners, for the regions like mine, for jobs. The Liberals' opposition is playing games. As I say, it's just about narrow political games because they think they can score a win on the media cycle. They need to look at the wider national interest. The pandemic taught us we need to improve our supply chains, we need to build more things here. And the opposition has a choice of revitalising manufacturing or turning their backs on Australian manufacturing once again. The NRF will be independent. It will have an independent board that makes independent decisions about investments in Australia's best interests, not in political sectional interests, in Australia's best interests. So the irony of the coalition talking about inappropriate ministerial discretion is just so rich. There won't be a colour-coded spreadsheet in sight, and there certainly won't be a secret industry minister making decisions for their mates. Deputy Speaker, the NRF is one of our key planks, as is the Housing Australia Future Fund. Other key planks of this government in the 8 months since the election: fixing aged care, strengthening Medicare, extending paid parental leave, making medicines cheaper, providing fee-free TAFE, funding extra regional uni places, improving the NBN, creating a national anti-corruption commission, launching the Robodebt Royal Commission, a renewable energy future, and holding a referendum to include First Nations people in the Constitution and provide a voice to the Parliament. We are getting on with the job that we were elected to do. We are just 8 months in, and it's a big job repairing the damage of 9 years of Liberal neglect. But we are not wasting a day. Thank you.
And I thank the member for Lyons for his contribution. The question is that grievances be noted, and I give the call to the member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Labor's plan to introduce the safeguard mechanism is just another attack on the high-vis workers of Australia and the heavy industries that keep the lights on in our country. The safeguard mechanism is another carbon tax with a facelift. Not unlike the carbon tax of the Gillard era, the safeguard mechanism serves to place a dollar figure on carbon emissions. Labor has determined that any heavy industry facility that emits more than 100,000 tonnes of Scope 1 greenhouse emissions must purchase credits for every tonne of carbon output over their baseline. When Julia Gillard introduced her carbon tax, the price she put on a tonne of carbon was $23. Now the Albanese government has decided that each tonne will cost a business $75 and by 2030 will increase to $100 a tonne. Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions are assigned to any industry that emits carbon through a manufacturing process such as manufacturing cement or steel, emissions from a mining truck transporting natural resources, or the production of electricity. The Climate Change Minister made a passing visit to Gladstone in January to announce the 215 heavy industry businesses that fall under the Scope 1 emissions will be required to purchase credits. It will also be mandatory for these facilities to cut their emissions by 5% every year until 2030 in order for Labor to hit its climate targets. Of the 215 businesses that will be hit, 63 are located in Queensland. All but 2 of these businesses are situated in the regions. Central Queensland will become the epicentre of Labor's carbon tax, with almost 75% of the facilities located in just 2 federal electorates. 28 operate in my electorate of Capricornia and 18 in the electorate of Flynn. Some of the facilities affected in my electorate include a rail freight facility, magnesia processing plant and a number of mines across the electorate, all of which contributes heavily to the economy. In Capricornia alone, the total economic contribution of the resource sector in 21-22 financial year is worth over $315 million in gross product, and 1,918 locals were employed. 166 local businesses and charities situated in Capricornia shed $50 million in direct spending in this same period. Coal, metal and gas mining has pumped $9.4 billion back into the Queensland economy, and 1 in every 6 jobs in the state is within this sector. 14,303 businesses and 1,415 charities have all shared in $27 billion of direct spending. Some might think they don't benefit from the hard work of miners, yet in the 21-22 financial year period, $9 billion in royalties went into funding education, roads and health. Queensland supplies the world with elements, minerals and metals, supporting the economic development of Australia and many other nations. There have been many federally funded projects that without the wealth of regional Australian mines would never have happened. Major projects in my electorate of Capricornia, such as the Rockhampton Airport redevelopment, $45 million, flood-proofing the Bruce Highway into Rockhampton, $136 million, Rookwood Weir, $183.6 million, safety upgrades to the Eaton Range, $166 million, were all made possible because of the resource industry. While the resource sector has been a mainstay of the Australian economy for the past 100 years, the strength of the industry was particularly noticeable during COVID. Supporting the Australian economy, it helped cushion the blow of damaging economic impacts that may have been experienced the past few years. The growth within the resources industry has been nothing short of astonishing. In 20 years, the gross value added to the Australian economy grew from $35 billion in 2000-2001 period to $22 billion by 2020-21. Despite what the Treasurer would like Australians to believe, Labor inherited a strong budget, largely supported by the minerals and energy sector. In my electorate of Capricornia and across Australia, families and businesses are struggling with the cost of living crisis. The announcement by the Labor government to impose a carbon tax has more far-reaching effect than just on the company operating these facilities. It will affect how much families pay to switch a light on, put fuel in their car and higher grocery bills. We as a country continue to rely on coal as a source of affordable and reliable electricity. Australia is on the verge of a key resources mining boom to meet the high demand for critical minerals that are required when creating low-emission technologies, battery production and electric vehicles. An electric car requires 6 times the amount of minerals than a regular vehicle. A wind turbine requires several more times the amount of minerals required for gas or coal-fired power stations. More than 220 tonnes of coal is needed to build a wind turbine. It is a rather inconvenient truth for climate activists that in order to decarbonise our nation, we need more mining. With cost of living already bringing people to their knees, now is not the time to impose new legislation to make it harder for families or risk heavy job losses across an industry that has supported Australia to become what it is today. During the previous government, we invested almost $2.5 billion to support the resource industries that support us. Thousands of new jobs were created to help families and the towns in which they live. Yet the Labor government are wanting to impose further legislation to stifle the industry and prevent further growth and investment, while in turn driving up household bills even further to meet their climate objectives. As the Leader of the Opposition has stated, the Coalition does support emissions reductions. What we are not backing is Labor's move to legislate taxes to reach targets. We must learn from what is occurring across the world, where there have been more than 2,000 climate change legal cases related to carbon emission reduction legislation. These legislations have shelved major projects in countries like the United Kingdom. Major infrastructure projects have ground to a halt, while activists have claimed that the work is not conducive with supporting emission reductions. Our country and its people cannot afford the economic ramifications of stopping major infrastructure development. As seen in my home state, the state Labor government increased coal royalties has had major negative impacts across central Queensland. Following the Palaszczuk government's decision to create higher coal royalties, BHP suspended its plans to build a new coal mine, causing the loss of $1 billion investment into the region. 750 construction jobs and 1,200 mining jobs were lost. While BMA, who has delivered $17 billion back into Queensland economy, has stated that they will not make further investments into central Queensland. These decisions have dire consequences for the small rural towns who rely on these mines to boost their economy. While nationally the effects of the safeguard mechanism is already beginning to occur, with Ampol revealing that they will suspend investment decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars due to Labor's energy policies. While the Coalition was in government, we supported a carbon trading scheme that allowed businesses to voluntarily reduce their emissions while being rewarded. Labor's changes to the safeguard mechanism will force businesses to buy credits. This is a tax. This safeguard mechanism, Carbon Tax 2.0, is going to drive up living costs at a time Australian workers and families can least afford it. Businesses will be forced to pass the increase on of production onto consumers through higher electricity prices, higher food bills and higher fuel costs during a time when we as a government must look at putting downward pressure on inflation, interest rates, costs of living and business. The Labor government is determined to make decisions that will negatively impact the industry and everything that relies on the benefits that resources bring. Our economy is already under the strain of a Labor government and we are not 12 months into their leadership. Labor do not have tangible solutions to see our country through the cost of living crisis. Their only plan is more taxes. Taxing the companies who drive the economy, bring investment to the regions and deliver jobs that support families and the communities. It is clear that energy-intensive companies in agribusiness, transport and mining will be hit. That is why we got rid of the mining tax and the carbon tax. Day after day, the Prime Minister talks about everything but the cost of living, the #1 issue that Australians are facing. This government has broken multiple promises to ease living pressures and instead have taken actions which have directly placed pressure on interest rate and electricity prices. Families and businesses across Australia are still waiting on the promise delivered 97 times during the election that their electricity bills would be reduced under a Labor government. By the government's own admission, power prices are set to rise by more than 63% and gas by 40% over the following 2 years. Family and businesses can't afford this. New solutions, not taxes, must occur. The global demand for mineral and energy commodities will continue to accelerate as new technologies are calling for larger supply of our resources. Hundreds of thousands of jobs are on the line if the Labor government continues with their plan of punishing the resource sector with taxes. The ones to suffer will be families and communities that greatly benefit from the industry. Thank you.
The question is that grievances be noted, and I give the call to the member for Boothby.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise today to congratulate some of the brilliant citizens from my electorate of Boothby who were rightly honoured in this year's Australia Day honours. First amongst them is Australian of the Year Taryn Brumfitt. Taryn is an inspirational woman whose courage and authenticity has inspired millions around the globe to love their bodies. She also happens to live around the corner from me. Hi, Taryn. I'm sure Taryn will be an excellent Australian of the Year, and the Boothby community is so proud to count Taryn as one of our own. Now, Deputy Speaker, I would like to take this time to congratulate some of our local citizens and events who also were given awards across Boothby this January. City of Mitcham Citizen of the Year is Peter Cranwell. Peter and his wife Nancy have made an extraordinary commitment to their local and wider community since returning to Blackwood from Lee Creek in South Australia's outback in the 1990s. As the project manager of Climate Action Resources Expo, held at Blackwood in November, Peter brought together a host of speakers along with workshops and displays to raise awareness and share ideas on sustainable living. Peter and Nancy have also been long-time supporters of migrant families and international students, remote First Nations communities and residents of Minda House supported accommodation at Craigburn Farm. City of Holdfast Bay Citizen of the Year is Cheryl Perkins. As a member of the Brighton Church of Christ, Cheryl has been the driving force behind Grocer with a Heart, a local shop where people could get healthy food at little or no cost. Using connections with supermarkets, farmers, bakeries, Grocer with a Heart distributes fruit, vegetables and grocery items to people experiencing food insecurity. Many of their customers are ineligible for other charitable programs and are at risk of falling through the cracks. Cheryl's invited me down to visit Grocer with a Heart, and I look forward to seeing this fantastic operation. The award for active citizenship went to the Rotary Club of Holdfast Bay. Since 2019, the club has run twice yearly food drives in local shopping centres. In that time, it's estimated that more than $90,000 worth of food and household items has been distributed to people in need. Rotary Club representative Kim Hardy accepted the award. I joined them for their Christmas drive at Brighton Foodland last year, and the generosity of locals and the commitment of the club members was overwhelming. It was also quite a lot of fun. Holdfast Bay Young Citizen of the Year is Hayley Hosking. Hayley is a role model for young and female surf lifesavers. She joined the Seacliff Surf Lifesaving Club when she was a child, and the now 19-year-old has progressed to be Vice Captain of Patrols and has volunteered more than 400 hours on patrol in the 2021-22 summer season. In 2022, she was named the Youth Lifesaver of the Year at the Surf Lifesaving Australia National Awards of Excellence. So many congratulations to Hayley. Our Holdfast Bay local hero is Bronwyn Watt. Bronwyn put together the Sister Love 27-hour Spin Fight MND Challenge fundraiser. The challenge was held at the Glenelg Surf Lifesaving Club to raise funds to support a cure for motor neurone disease after her sister was diagnosed in 2021. More than 500 riders participated, and Bronwyn raised an amazing $80,000 for the cause. And having worked in the fundraising field, I can tell you that is amazing for one event. The Holdfast Bay Community Event of the Year award went to the Youth Photographic Exhibition. It was presented to Phil and Kathy Holgate from Somerton Park Rotary Club, which instigated the Youth Photographic Exhibition held at Bay Discovery Centre last year. Local schools and young people were encouraged to get involved and use photography as a way to explore their creativity around the themes of nature and the environment. The two-week exhibition showcased more than 100 photos taken by 67 primary school students and attracted more than 1,700 visitors to the Bay Discovery Centre. Thirdly, City of Marion. The City of Marion Citizen of the Year is Pat Munden. Pat is known affectionately as the matriarch of the Cooenda Neighbourhood Centre, having volunteered at the centre for 40 years. Pat also received a commendation in the South Australia 2023 Awards for Active Citizenship. The commendation was presented at an Australia Day Council of South Australia ceremony hosted by the Governor of South Australia, Her Excellency the Honourable Francis Adamson AC. City of Marion Young Citizen of the Year is Zane LeBlond. Zane is an active member of City of Marion's Youth Collective Committee, volunteering his time and social media skills to many events for local young people. The 18-year-old is also involved in the Channel 44 community television documentary on the Skate Days 2 event and Stage 2 opening of the Capella Drive Reserve at Hallett Cove. And he facilitated workshops for the Youth Collective Committee at their Voice It report. I have had the pleasure of meeting Zane, and I have to say he is indeed very impressive. City of Marion Sportsperson of the Year award went to Jamie Morgan. Jamie is the director of the juniors and seniors at Plympton Football Club, and he played an instrumental role in the Mighty Bulldogs taking out the SANFL Junior Club of the Year for 2022, as well as helping the club win 6 premiership flags. The club thanks him for his very long hours and dedication to the cause. City of Marion Community Event of the Year is the Oaklands Estate Reserve Park Run. This was established in early 2022 by Denise Brent, Kevin Thompson and a team of volunteers, and has become extremely popular with local residents. The event's part of the Park Run movement, where volunteers run free 5-kilometre events for walkers, runners of all ages and all levels of fitness, some with dogs, some with prams, some as a family, every Saturday morning. The Oaklands Estate Reserve Park Run provides a positive outlook on fitness, and they also have a vision impaired guide for those who need. The great thing about Park Run is you never come last. There's a tail walker whose job is to come last. Oaklands Estate Park Run is also my home park run. On those rare occasions I can make it at 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning. We also had a number of Boothby members who were nominated for Australia Day Awards, including Emeritus Professor Linda Barwick for significant service to preservation and digitisation of cultural heritage records, Barry Presgrave, OAM, for significant service to veterans and emergency service organisations, the late Mr Neville Cordes for service to the community of Kangaroo Island, Keith Fowler for service to veterans and their families, Emeritus Professor Nagana Feen for service to the law and to the legal profession, Dr Joylene O'Hazy for service to the community and to medicine. Dr O'Hazy is one of the founding members of Zonta's Birthing Kits program that saves the lives of mothers and babies in third world countries around the world, and I've been pleased to join her and the Hills Zonta for a birth kit packing day. Mr Rodney Smith for service to music education, and Mr John Woodside for service to the construction industry. Deputy Speaker, I'd like to offer my congratulations to all of these amazing people, as well as those who were nominated. You've all achieved amazing things, and it's people like you and organisations like you that make our community what it is. Thank you.
I give the call to the member for New England.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a great pleasure that I rise for this grievance debate. And I want to start, Madam Deputy Speaker, with a quote from the Labor candidate who, and it's great. That's what I want. I want a Labor candidate against me in election because we want to give the people a free run. But this is what she said. She said, Labor has already made 2 significant local announcements in this campaign, which go ahead if an Albanese government is elected, regardless of the result in New England. Sounds great. Labor has committed to the establishment of an urgent care clinic to relieve the pressure on Tamworth Hospital and $580,000 to establish more crisis accommodation for 52 families escaping domestic violence, including 4 staff, to support these families through their crisis. And here it is on the Labor Party paraphernalia. Now, we asked the question, or Senator Mackenzie asked the question, because we're curious about this. We wondered what had happened to it. Senator Bridget Mackenzie, Victorian Senator, said, can the department advise whether either the Investing in Our Communities or Priority Community Infrastructure program are delivering the government's election commitment to establish more crisis accommodation for 52 families escaping domestic violence in the New England electorate, costing $580,000, as per the Labor flyer, as per the Labor announcement, regardless of who won the election? Madam Deputy Speaker, the answer has come back. The Department of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development, Communications and the Arts has no record of any commitments to crisis accommodation projects being delivered by our department in the local government area within the New England region. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the Labor Party. Completely and utterly unbelievable, completely untrustworthy, does not stick to their word. And I asked them, and I don't know whether anyone's watching this, I know if you are, if you can't get to sleep or whatever, this should be honoured. You can't make promises and just not honour them. I want to go through a couple of others which are very important for my electorate. Dungowan Dam. Now, Mr Albanese used to always taunt me when we were in the government, when the member for Riverina and I were in the government, that we hadn't built dams. So we actually put a lot of money on the table for dams. Wangler Dam, Dungowan Dam, Hell's Gate, with also Emu Swamp. Up there, Scottsdale irrigation scheme, which actually did a fair bit of that. And then Bowen Pipeline, Urana Dam, and then as soon as the Labor and the Greens got in, of course, all the dams went. But Dungowan Dam was a big one because we're the city of Tamworth. It's just growing. It's growing like topsy. People are pouring in from Sydney. I was talking to one real estate agent. 1 in every 4 houses in Tamworth now are sold to someone moving out of Sydney. And these people who are coming in from Sydney want a job. And they can only get a job if there's water security for the city. Now, we had to fight to get the extension of Chaffey Dam, and the Greens fought against it. The Burlong frog raised its head, couldn't do it. And apparently what the problem was with Dungowan Dam is a skink. There was a lizard. Lizards here. I don't know, I thought lizards might just walk up the hill a bit. But if we don't get an extension of water security for the city of Tamworth, Madam Deputy Speaker, then the billions, and I mean that, the billions of dollars of investment and the thousands and thousands of jobs, because Tamworth is one, if not the biggest, processor of animal protein in Australia. If Tamworth's not working, you're not eating. 80% of the meat you eat, if you eat from Woolworths, gets killed in Tamworth. And they need water security. These are blue-collar workers. They are blue-collar workers. They're boners, they're the people who work in that blue-collar Olympics called animal meat processing, whether it's sheep, whether it's cattle, whether it's eggs, whether it's poultry. That's why we need the dam, but the dam's been delayed. Now, what that means, delayed, is kicked into the long grass. And that's a terrible shame. It shows that the Labor Party and the Greens don't, well, forget about the Greens, I don't know why you carried, I don't know why they run you. but it shows you don't have the courage to do something which should actually get you votes. If you want to get this candidate, what her name was, Laura Hughes, seems like a really nice lady, nurse, good lady, but if she's not got a hope in a place like New England, unless the Labor Party shows the gumption to stand up against the Greens and say, we're going to build the dam, we're going to do it. But otherwise, Laura Hughes is just going through the motions. There's not a chance for her. But there are other things that were delayed. We want to make sure that Armidale becomes the epicentre of AgVet chemicals, not only in Australia, but in Southeast Asia. We need a regulatory science. See, a lot of the other countries like Thailand, like Indonesia say, well, why do we all have our different regulatory programs? Why wouldn't we just have one and we can base it? And Armidale was a place which they were all turning up to. They'll say, we'll go through the process through the university there. So we put some money aside to get this thing started. And this was going to give us, to be quite frank, people will probably never vote for me. When I moved APVMA up to Armidale, I'll give you one thing, it's a great move, and I'm pretty sure most people don't vote for me. But it was a great move. And this would also be a great move. And it would actually support some of those really high line jobs for people who could extend their experience in the sciences into a job in a regional area. They get a better bang for their buck, a more affordable house, easier access to the kids where they're going to school, a better lifestyle because they're basically near the national parks, near the beaches, lower cost of living, a better bang for their buck. But why was it pulled? Why was the funding pulled? If I was really parochial, I'd say, you pulled the funding for something, for a group of people who, I'll be frank, I'm a realist, they'd never vote for me. But they should have done that. They should have been big enough to say, let's do this. It's a good thing for Armidale, good thing for Australia, good thing for Labor Party voters, to be quite frank. Guyra Early Learning Centre, $4.2 million. You pulled the funding on that. Well, you talk about you wanting to look after kids and look after families, except when you get to a regional area, then you don't want to look after them. So the people in Guyra can just go without. And they got kids too. I mean, Vicky always informs me it's one of the big issues of how you get your kids looked after, because if the kids don't go into a childcare centre, into an early learning centre, mum can't go to work or dad can't go to work. And I'll be factual in country areas. Mum doesn't go to work. Mum has to stay home. So if Guyra's not funded, mum stays home, means mum doesn't have a job, which means you've disenfranchised mum of her potential by reason that you haven't funded this. And it should be done. If you want to be a government for Australia, not a government for some parts of Australia, then make sure you look after regional areas. Armidale Rugby League Club. Look, when I went to their grandstand, honestly, the girls and the guys, they both play rugby league now, the girls are getting changed under a grandstand. Like there's seats there, the seats, they get under the grandstand. It is horrific. It's cold, people can stare in, they can stare into the change room and see you as you're having a shower. We're trying to get it fixed. We want it fixed. But that funding's gone. That means that they go back to it. Madam Deputy Speaker, when I announced that, the ladies who arrived at that announcement were crying. That's how important it was. They were crying. It was so important to them. Scheme of things, $600,000 is a lot of money, but in the federal budget it's not. And it really touched me that we could make such a difference, that these people were driven, turning up, and they were so emotionally affected, but you've ripped the rug out from underneath their feet. Tenterfield bypass, you want things that are safe. Tenterfield bypass is going to make we had a truck, it was flammable liquid, it caught on fire just outside my office. If that had blown up, we would have had deaths. We've got to get those trucks out of town, and Tenterfield bypass does that. Now, I've heard on the grapevine, this is a big part of my grievance, what the Labor Party's going to do, and the member for Riverina will be interested in this, the way they're going to fix our country roads, listen to this, member for Riverina, is they're going to reduce the speed limits. So that rather than make the roads suitable to the speed, they're reducing the speed limits so that everybody just has to go slower in regional areas. Now, if there's a grievance, you never get a better grievance for that. So I say to the Labor Party, when you get the great opportunity, the great blessing of running this government. You have to be a government for everybody, And maybe this is something for the Prime Minister, that when he's got a bit of spare time, when he's getting bored, when he's in the Mardi Gras and he's walking along and he's wanting something to think about, he might think about the people as he's holding his glow wands and walking along and having a wonderful old time, to think about the people that he's left behind.
Thank you, Member. I give the call to the member for Adelaide.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And Deputy Speaker, I, like most of us in this place, take the job of being a Member of Parliament very seriously, and you'd like to think that most MPs who are here do the same thing. The people in the electorate of Adelaide deserve to be heard and to be listened to, and I find that that is my number one responsibility as a Member of Parliament, to hear what they have to say and to try and fulfil their needs. And this has been my focus ever since becoming a Member of Parliament, and I will continue to fight for my electorate and listen to my electorate and try and deliver for my electorate. Now, one of the first things I campaigned on before I became a Member of Parliament, when I was a candidate way back in 1998, was the Adelaide Airport curfew. There was no curfew back then, and the residents had formed a residents' association in and around the airport, and were demanding a curfew. In other words, not to allow planes in between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. And I fought very hard for that, and I give credit as well to my predecessor, Chris Gallus, who brought a private member's bill to this place and had it passed. But if it wasn't for the action of the community, nothing would have happened. So we were finally successful in establishing a ban on those passenger-carrying jet flights between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m, and that was in the year 2000. Many airports in major cities have curfews. It's not unusual. For example, LaGuardia in New York has a curfew. Hong Kong even has a curfew of a sort, where flights are allowed to come in only through one direction after much earlier than ours, actually. I think it's after 9 p.m. And of course, in Holland, the major airport there as well has a curfew. In Adelaide, the Adelaide Airport is so close to the city. It's 6 kilometres from the CBD. And we're very lucky to have an airport so close. It keeps transport costs down, it keeps freight costs down, because it is so close to the CBD. But it also means it's smack bang in the middle of thousands of residential homes. So what you need is a good balance between the interests of the airport, the interests of the economy, and a good airport infrastructure, and the interests and a good balance with the residents who live in and around the airport. So I continue to receive emails from constituents, and I always have received emails and letters and phone calls from constituents in and around the airport from day one when I was elected, on all sorts of things of, I suppose, flights coming in after curfew hours or cargo planes coming in. And I'm actually pleased the member for Riverina is here as well, because as Transport Minister, I wrote many, many letters to him, and I've got to say he always responded and tried to do what was best for the residents and the airport. So, for example, recently I wrote to the Minister for Transport and Infrastructure on behalf of one of my constituents in North Adelaide. Now, North Adelaide is just in the northern part of the CBD, and it's right under the flight path, so it is affected by aircraft noise continuously. My constituent was frustrated by the number of flights that appear to be landing at Adelaide Airport using flight path 23, which requires them to fly over North Adelaide, Walkerville, and all the residential areas, Mile End, Cowndilla, Richmond, and Thebarton, Torrensville. I could name Brooklyn Park, which is actually in the electorate of Hindmarsh now, Brooklyn Park. But he was saying to me that he feels that it's an unacceptable number of flights both during and outside the designated curfew that are using flight path 23. Now, according to the Adelaide Airport Curfew Act, these flights are not to be going through flight path 23, and my constituent says they're illegal unless they're given a dispensation before they left their departure airport. Now, during the curfew, flights must land using runway 5. Now, the curfew doesn't mean that there's no flights coming in. It's the lesser, noisier aeroplanes that are coming in and the non-commercial flights, passenger flights. The reports that I've been getting from constituents is that they're often woken by flights using this landing path 23 when they should be using landing path, I think it's number 5, which is over the sea. Clearly, there are times when the wind conditions might require this, and we can understand this. However, this seems to happen even when conditions are favourable. So you can see the concern by the residents. Now, if Hong Kong can do it during curfew hours, if Hong Kong Airport can have them flying in over the ocean into the airport, I can't see why a city like Adelaide can't do it. Deputy Speaker, the disruption and noise pollution caused by the number of flights is a serious problem for residents. If you're a shift worker, if you have small children, I recall many years ago door knocking in Richmond had all sorts of issues. The airport was coming on as a regular basis, and I remember seeing a mum who had 4 kids, and she was saying that the kids get woken up in the morning as soon as the first flights take off, and you can hear them. She was very close to the airport. From here to maybe the Senate was the distance. So you imagine the jets, when they rev up in the morning, they actually start them a good hour before they fly in the morning as well to warm them up, apparently. And I actually went down there one morning at 5:30, 6 a.m. At this constituent's invitation. And yes, by 5:30 there was just noise galore. Everything else is quiet, so the noise travels. And her kids, true to her word, woke up one by one when they weren't meant to wake up till 7:30. So I've raised this again and again with past ministers, with the current minister, and I'll continue to fight for the strengthening and preservation of the Adelaide Airport curfew. And from time to time, we have different groups that come out and call for the curfew to be abolished, and that would be outrageous if that happens. And as I said, we're very lucky in Adelaide to have the curfew 6 kilometres from the CBD. Which is a great help to businesses, to transport agencies, to a whole range of businesses that use the airport, and to constituents that live in the airport. It only takes me 10 minutes to get to the airport. I could walk down there within 25 minutes. So I'm very lucky in that sense. But at the same time, the airport is smack bang in the middle of 25,000 residential homes, and we've got to have a good balance, and I think we've got the balance quite well at the moment. It's just getting them to stick to some of the rules that currently exist. Deputy Speaker, sticking sort of with transport and infrastructure, one of the first things that people in the electorate of Adelaide, when I became the candidate in Adelaide in 2018-19, raised with me was the dangerous level crossing at Ovingham at the Churchill-Torrens Roads intersection. If anyone knows that area, there's massive freight trains that go by regularly, and the bars would go down and you could get caught for up to 30 minutes there. Now, this intersection is one of the busiest intersections. It leads from the western suburbs to the northern suburbs. Thousands of cars, I think it's about 22,000 cars per hour that use that roadway, so you can imagine the disruption for years with the freight trains and the trains. And I was so pleased that as the member, I campaigned very hard for it, writing to different ministers. And again, the Minister for Infrastructure, former Minister for Infrastructure and Transport is here. This did start under the previous government, the infrastructure work, but it was called for by many people in the area, state members of parliament, myself. So last Sunday I was very pleased to go to the opening and see it come to fruition, the opening of the Ovingham overpass, which now has built a beautiful bridge that flows over the train lines and veers to the right for people wanting to go north to the northern suburbs and west down to the port of Adelaide and the western suburbs. And I'm just so pleased that it's now delivered, it's up and working, and it was an absolute pleasure on the weekend to join locals, local residents, the South Australian Premier, Peter Malinauskas, the State Member for Adelaide, Lucy Hood, to officially do the opening of the upgrade. And the intersection is used, as I said, by many commuters. In fact, I understand that more than 21,000 vehicles, I'll correct what I said earlier, 21,000 vehicles cross the new bridge each day. So you can imagine taking 30 minutes out per day. if you get caught there 2-3 times a week, that could be anything up to an hour that you're delayed, that you miss out from your home life. An hour of putting it could be the difference between getting home on time and putting the kids to bed, the difference between getting home on time and reading a story to the children, or just a good family time when you add up, even if it's 10 minutes per day, 10 in the morning, 10 at night. All of a sudden there's a good hour there that you can spend with your family. And these are the infrastructure projects that make a real difference to people's lives. But also, I asked some of the people involved in the build that were down there on the weekend about how many people were employed, and around 1,000 people were employed directly and indirectly through this job. It was value of $253 million, I think.
The member's time
was 50%.
has expired. Thank you. I give the call to the member for Riverina.
Speaker, I have a real grievance with bank closures, and I'll give credit where credit's due. I received a letter yesterday from the Regional General Manager, Customer Service Network of the Commonwealth Bank, Norm Swift, who wrote to me saying that following consideration of a request from the Senate Standing Committee on Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport, requesting them to pause regional branch closures until the end of 2023, he's advising that we have agreed to do so, and this includes the postponement of the current closure at Junee. But it's probably just as well that I'm doing this grievance and Maisie Robinson, 88, is not, because she would probably choose her words less carefully than perhaps I would, because she's pretty annoyed. She's hot under the collar. She's been a member of the Commonwealth branch at Junee for 80 years, and she's been told to change her banking habits, her banking practices. Now, when you've been a member of a branch for 80 years, you've given them your money, you've given them your loyalty, you've given them your commitment, and they just go and shut the door in your face. It's not good enough. And so well done to CBA for postponing their closure. I hope postponing isn't the word, cancelling should be the word. They need to absolutely give that permanency to Junee. They need to make a commitment to regional Australia. They've done very, very well out of regional Australia, and particularly out of Junee. It's a railway town, it's a jail town, it's a vibrant agricultural town. It's got a lot of things happening for it. And the fact that they've pulled out of Junee, or intending to pull out of Junee, is simply not good enough for a town the population of which is 6,500 people. So, and that will leave Junee without a bank. So it's time that the Commonwealth Bank realised that their customers have been loyal, in Maisie's case, for 80 years. So rethink this really hard, because the Mayor there, Neil Smith, is not going to take it, nor is the General Manager of the Shire, James Davis, and nor am I. And rest assured, Maisie and the rest of the Junee community feel let down, and they will air their grievances long and loud.
Thank you, Member. I give the call to the member for Meakin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I say I concur entirely with the comments made by the member for Riverina about bank closures. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm completely perplexed to understand why there is opposition in this parliament to the National Reconstruction Fund Corporation Bill and the Housing Australia Future Fund Bill. Both of those bills were not only election commitments for which the Albanese government has a mandate for, but both of those bills make significant investments in our country and in our economy. Indeed, they are perhaps two of the most important bills that will come before this parliament in the term of this government. And that is why the Albanese government is bringing them on early, because they deal with matters that need to be urgently addressed and which will take years to address, because they are matters that cannot be fixed overnight. Both of those bills will rebuild and strengthen the Australian economy. And by, for example, rebuilding manufacturing capability, we not only create skills, which in itself is an area of debate in this place, but jobs will be created. It will provide security for the nation and for the individual. It will create exports that we can send overseas. That in turn will mean that we'll be less reliant on imports that come from overseas, which we saw how they crippled the nation, particularly over the last couple of years as a result of the COVID pandemic. Those bills will also reduce social costs and the stress that is currently being placed on people who, for example, can't find work or can't get a roof over their head. Those social costs lead to health outcomes which also have to be addressed, and the cost that comes with all of those. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I just make these two, I think, very simple points. In the post-war years after World War II, governments right around the country of both persuasions, Labor and Liberal, did exactly what these two bills propose to do. They might have done them differently, but the general principle of building homes and building housing stock and building your manufacturing base is exactly what they did to boost their economy and secure the future for our country for the years that followed. And that did happen, and I can certainly talk from experience in South Australia, where I witnessed it with my own eyes. It made a difference, and can I say, it was led by a Liberal government, not a Labor government. And the same with the housing policies, which put a roof over people's head. Now, I say to members opposite, certainly the bills may not do everything you want them to do, and if that is the case, move amendments. But to oppose them just simply doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense from a political point of view, and it certainly doesn't make sense from the point of view of trying to secure the future of this country for all Australians.
Thank you, Member. The time for the grievance debate has expired. The debate is interrupted in accordance with Standing Order 192B. The debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of the day for the next sitting. I call the member.
I move that the Federation Chamber do now adjourn.
And second?
I second the member for Makin's fine motion.
Thank you. The question is that the motion be agreed to. All those of the opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The Federation Chamber stands adjourned until 9:30 a.m. tomorrow. Thank you.